interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast. The German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. I repeat, the German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. There was no Allied confirmation. The German broadcast could be one which Allied leaders have expected would be made with the purpose of upsetting Patriot plans inside the conquered countries. This bulletin has come to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. There is no Allied confirmation. The Associated Press recorded the broadcast which said the invasion had begun from the west and that the French port of Le Havre was being shelled. Le Havre lies 100 miles from the English port of Portsmouth and is 80 miles south of the English coastal town of New Haven. German naval forces off the coast are engaged in a battle with enemy landing craft, the broadcast said. The German news agency said the Allied invasion operations began with the landing of airborne troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine River. I repeat, however, that there is no Allied confirmation of this claim. We return you now to your regular scheduled broadcast. And now here's a bulletin that's just been handed me. This announcement came on the heels of a disclosure from Washington that our submarines have sunk 16 more Japanese cargo vessels. That's the score against the Japs. Now for the Germans. London says the British submarines had sunk 31 Nazi ships in the Mediterranean and Aegean. 5 of them were naval craft. 7 more were damaged. And on the debit side, as far as European operations are concerned, is the loss of a United States escort carrier in the North Atlantic. The baby flat top was the Rock Island and probably was sunk by Nazi bombers. There are no details, but the Navy says our casualties were light, and next of kin have been notified. The score again, 48 German and Japanese ships sunk, 10 have been damaged. 36 Jap planes destroyed. This against the loss of 1 American plane and 1 American escort carrier. Tired, bewildered Nazi legions are fleeing north of Rome tonight as victorious Allied troops continue their heavy assaults on the captured Italian capital. Just how far the Nazis will be smashed back at this time is not yet clear. However, observers predict that they ultimately will have to retire to a mountain line, 150 miles north of Rome. The Vichy broadcast says the Germans have abandoned the entire left bank of the Tiber River, from its mouth to Rome. Italian civilians crowded the streets today, cheering and applauding as Allied troops poured into the city. Some sidewalks of faith were thronged. but most of the business places in Rome were closed. NBC reporter Ralph Howard said in the broadcast from Rome tonight that the Allies today brought in their first food to be distributed among the hungry populace, and added that more and more food and medical supplies will reach Rome daily. And now here's a bulletin that's just been handed me. As I said when I first went on the air a few minutes ago, the Associated Press says the Berlin radio broadcast tonight that the Allied invasion has begun, that our troops are landing at Le Havre, but there is still no Allied confirmation. This may be an enemy trick. There has been no Allied confirmation, I repeat. Now, on with the news. King Victor Emmanuel has turned over his royal powers to his son, Prince Umberto. The Italian king thus kept the promise he made several months ago when he said he would step down when Rome was liberated. President Roosevelt, using the language of golf, has declared that the liberation of Rome makes it 1 up with 2 to go. In other words, the Allied job now is to take Berlin and Tokyo. The president said in this connection that a tough struggle lies ahead. He declared that the Germans had suffered some heavy blows, but not enough to knock them out of the war. RAF heavy bombers have sought out tonight to keep the Allied aerial offensive going past its 19th hour. The night targets appear to be in France or the lowlands. Mosquito bombers at the same time have been reported raiding Germany. And the Russians have thrown back more German attacks in fierce fighting at Iasi in Romania. Red Airmen also have winged 75 miles southeast of Iasi to batter Nazi supply trains and equipment. The Germans sent their electrically controlled midget tanks into the Iasi battle, but failed to gain. And here at home tonight, the House tonight deferred until tomorrow a vote on a resolution to extend to June 7th, 1945, the time limit for courts-martial of Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short. That's the news of the moment. This is the NBC Newsroom in New York. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
The German radio claims this morning that the Allied invasion of Europe has begun. There is no confirmation as yet from London, Washington, or any other Allied source. And if I may, at this early hour in the morning, recapitulate the invasion news as it has been transmitted to the NBC newsroom here in Washington so far by the Associated Press. The first invasion bulletin came from London, dated London, Tuesday, June 6th. A broadcast of the German Transocean Agency said today the invasion began in the first hours of this morning. That is the original bulletin received regarding the invasion. And may I interpolate here to say that the German Transocean Agency is the official German news agency and obviously a Nazi propaganda agent. The second bulletin, which was received here in Washington at 12:43 a.m. Eastern Wartime, says this: London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German radio said today that German warships are battling enemy landing ships at Le Havre. There is no confirmation from Allied sources. And then a later bulletin received says this: London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German news agency, Transocean, said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. The German broadcast could be one which Allied leaders have expected would be made with the purpose of upsetting patriot plans inside the conquered countries. Then add to that bulletin goes on, the Associated Press recorded the German Transocean broadcast, which said that the invasion had begun from the west and that the French port of Le Havre was being shelled. Now, as you know, Le Havre lies 100 miles from the English port of Portsmouth and is 80 miles south of the English coastal town of New Haven. German naval forces off the coast are being engaged in a battle with enemy landing craft, which would be Allied landing craft, of course, since this is a German broadcast. This broadcast was recorded in London shortly after 6:30 o'clock Tuesday morning. That is 12:30 a.m. Tuesday morning, Eastern Wartime, here in the United States. And the German agency said that Allied, quote, invasion operations, unquote, began with the landing of airborne troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine River in France. The Seine River empties into the Atlantic at Le Havre after winding northwestward through France from the capital at Paris. These reported landings, if true, could be an Allied feint of which Prime Minister Churchill had warned the Allied world to expect in advance of the main Allied invasion blows. The Germans have been predicting that the Allies would strike as soon as the Allied campaign in Italy showed good progress, as it has done with the liberation of Rome only yesterday. And as we know, the Allies have been battering the French Channel coast, of which Le Havre is a part, for months now as a prelude to the invasion. So far, ladies and gentlemen, all those bulletins which I have read to you come from the Associated Press from German Nazi sources. The only Allied statement we have at this hour in the morning says this: Washington. The War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. May I repeat that statement? Washington. The War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. Now, so far, as I pointed out, except that last bulletin from Washington, all this news is from Nazi sources. And this means, without doubt, one of three things. It may mean, first, that the Germans are merely fishing for information. The Nazis are jittery. They want to know the very worst way when this invasion is really going to come. And by putting out bulletins such as you have heard so far this evening from German sources, they may be trying to find out. The second possibility, of course, is this. In a speech not so long ago, Prime Minister Churchill was talking about the invasion. He said that when this invasion comes, there will be feints, dress rehearsals, and false alarms. Now, if these attacks are in progress, as the Germans report, these attacks, to quote the Prime Minister, could be only feints, dress rehearsals, or false alarms in advance of the real, main, concerted Allied invasion attempt. And the third possibility, of course, is that this really is the invasion and that the Germans have sent out the first word over their propaganda facilities. But so far, the War Department here in Washington says it has no information. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the invasion news up to this moment. Keep tuned to your NBC stations, which are prepared to bring you the fullest, official, authoritative news on the invasion. I return you now to the NBC newsroom in New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a report from NBC in Washington by Richard Harkness. We return you now to your regular program.
1 a.m. Eastern War Time this morning, BBC broadcast Allied High Command urgent instructions to people in Holland, advising them that if they are living within 35 kilometers, about 18 miles of the coast, to leave their homes immediately, and also to keep off roads, railroads, and bridges. These instructions from BBC followed in less than an hour after a German broadcast announcing that Allied parachute troops had landed in France. That report is not yet confirmed by any Allied sources. These bulletins came to you from the NBC newsroom in New York.
We return you now to our regularly scheduled program.
Bulletin from Western Europe. Before I read them, let me point out that there is no Allied confirmation of these reports. Bulletin from London, Tuesday, June 6th. 3 German news agencies tonight flashed word to the world that an Allied invasion of Western France had begun, with Allied parachute troops spilling out of the skies at dawn over the Normandy Peninsula. The German report said that seaborne forces had landed in the Le Havre area. There is no Allied confirmation. The Germans also said that Allied warships were furiously bombarding the big German-held French port of Le Havre at the mouth of the Seine River, 100 miles west of Paris. Berlin also said that German shock troops were hurled against Allied troops who were rushing ashore from landing barges. Le Havre, incidentally, lies 80 miles across the channel from the British coast. DNB, the German news agency, said Dunkirk and Calais, just across the channel from Britain, are now under attack by strong formations of Allied bombers. The German Transocean Agency said the long-expected invasion by the British and the Americans has begun. It began in the first hours of the morning of June 6th by the landing of parachute troops in the area of the mouth of the Seine. Allied headquarters, I repeat, remain silent. DNB agency said Le Havre is being violently bombarded at the present moment. That bulletin came out at 7 a.m. French time, 1 a.m. Eastern Wartime. DNB went on to say German naval forces are engaged in fighting with enemy landing craft off the coast. Calais and Dunkirk, which Berlin said were under heavy air attack, are also important French ports along the invasion coast just 150 miles northeast of Le Havre. DNB added that no enemy landings have been made as yet at Calais and Dunkirk. That obviously is an indication that the Germans are expecting Allied assaults all along the French coast. And just a little while ago, London radio broadcast urgent instructions to the people of Holland. These instructions told the people of Holland living within 18 miles of the coast to leave their homes immediately and to keep off the roads, railroads, and bridges. Let me repeat that there is as yet no Allied confirmation of any of these Berlin reports. This is the NBC newsroom in New York.
We return you now to your regularly scheduled program. The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night in view of the important, but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas. Now, for a report from NBC's observers in the nation's capital, we take you to Washington.
And this is Richard Harkness in the NBC newsroom in Washington. The Germans are proclaiming this morning, without Allied confirmation, that the Allied invasion of Europe has begun. The Germans say that Allied airborne troops are parachuting down over France and that Allied naval forces are bombarding Le Havre, the French port across the channel from Britain. So far, ladies and gentlemen, the news is this. The first word of this invasion, if it is an invasion, came from the Nazis. At 12:37 o'clock this morning, which is 6:37 a.m. in Great Britain, this word came flashing into the NBC newsroom from London. London, Tuesday, June 6th. The German news agency, Transocean, said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. Then, a few minutes later, the Nazi radio said this, that Allied warships that German warships are battling enemy landing ships at Le Havre. That German warships are battling enemy, which would be Allied landing ships, at Le Havre. Now, this German broadcast was recorded by the Associated Press in London and dispatched to this country. The broadcast added that Allied ships were bombarding the French city, which is just across the English Channel, some 80 miles from Great Britain. Still, there was and is no Allied confirmation of these reports. Then at 12:58 o'clock this morning, this bit of news, completely negative, came from Washington. The bulletin said this. The War Department says it has no information on reports by the German radio that invasion operations have begun on the French Channel coast. And then, only a few minutes ago, Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, rushed to his headquarters here in Washington this morning immediately after being notified of these German reports. Elmer Davis told a reporter, "We have no more information than you have. I'll stay here until I find out whether the story is true or not." And by 1:45 a.m. this morning, almost the entire public relations staff at the War Department had reported for duty in the big Pentagon building across the Potomac River in Virginia. Despite the fact of no Allied confirmation, only a few minutes later, there came a bulletin from London which seemed at least to indicate that activities of a military nature were underway across the channel. And coming quickly on the heels of our liberation of Rome, and so quickly, too, after President Roosevelt's address to the United States last night on our triumph in Italy. Shortly before 7 o'clock European time, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is an official British government branch, issued urgent instructions to the citizens of Holland in the strategic lowlands. The BBC advised all Hollanders living within 18 miles of the invasion coast to leave their homes immediately, to keep off the roads, to keep off the railroad lines, and to keep away from all bridges. And then, only a few minutes ago, another BBC broadcast recorded in New York warned residents of France that a new phase of the air war against the continent had begun and told them to stand by for further instructions that would be dropped by leaflet from American and British planes. And still later, the official German news agency, DNB, came into the picture with the German version of the news this evening. DNB said that Allied airborne troops were being landed in the vicinity of the Seine River, which is in the neighborhood of Le Havre. Presumably, the Germans said, the task of these airborne troops was to take a number of aerodromes on the continent of Europe. These troops, the Nazis went on, were parachuting down on the tip of the Normandy Peninsula. Now, that is the spot news on the invasion so far this evening. Only German claims with no confirmation whatsoever from any Allied force, either official or unofficial. And here in the studio with me in Washington this evening is my good friend and colleague, Morgan Beatty, NBC war analyst and Washington commentator. Mr. Beatty was in Britain during the preparations for the invasion, which still may be yet to come, and he is here this evening to discuss the aspects of the news as we have it so far. Here is Morgan Beatty.
Thank you, Dick. The important, tangible information the Germans give us about the invasion: local patrols backed by general support further back. Thus, the whole German problem along the Atlantic coast is to determine which attack from the Allies should be the real thing, so that their support forces can be called up to meet Allied attacks. If they fail in this piece of detective work, they'll find their main support forces wasting their time on empty coastal areas while Allied forces elsewhere make headway against very small protective garrisons. So, from the German point of view, it doesn't matter whether invasion has actually started or not. They want to fish for all they can get in the way of information. In the background, of course, they have their own information as to our preparations, information which they're careful to keep away from us. In this situation, it's only natural that the Allied High Command is not going to put out reports about Allied activity, if any, at this time. The Allied job, in case we should attack in the Le Havre area, is to prevent the Germans from knowing where to bring their support forces, their reinforcements, for a coastal area, that is, a coastal area, in fact, lightly held except for guns. It's noteworthy at this point that the Germans discovered the Dieppe raiders through their naval patrols. They depend on those patrols to signal the first Allied activities that depart from the normal. It's on the report of these patrols that their support forces further back must be called up. The German army, the main army defending that part of France behind Le Havre and similar coastal areas in that area, is probably based 20 to 40 miles back of the Atlantic. It's probable that the German left flank is based on Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic and their right flank in this zone on the Meuse River in Belgium. Between these 2 points, some 300 miles, the line runs along the Sarthe River to the Seine, north of Paris, then into Belgium along the Oise River. The Germans, by their reports to date, clearly indicate that they expect the Allies are trying to flush their defenses in this general line, that we are aiming either at Brittany or Normandy or Le Havre itself, the port for Paris. The most interesting phase of all these German bulletins we have been reporting to you is that the Allies have nothing to say anywhere, either in London or in Washington. So far as the Allied High Command is concerned, at this point, this is just another night.
You have just heard Richard Harkness and Morgan Beatty speaking from the NBC newsroom in Washington, bringing you a summary of the latest developments in the Germans' claim that invasion of Europe has started. Mr. Harkness and Mr. Beatty, along with other members of NBC's news staffs in Washington and New York, will continue throughout the night to keep our listeners informed of any later developments. We return you now to New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its coverage of these important but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas with Robert St. John speaking from the NBC newsroom in New York.
Here is one bulletin from London which we can all believe. Londoners were awakened in the early hours of this morning by the roar of planes. Londoners and the people on the coast of England saw the largest force of bombers and fighters ever to take the air. Fighters and bombers sailing away across the Channel. The latest Berlin broadcast is one which reveals the diabolical humor of the Nazis. It was the following brief announcement in English. This is D-Day. We shall now bring music for the Allied invasion forces. Diabolical humor. And now here's a little background to these German claims of Allied landings in France. For weeks now, the Allied Supreme Command has been warning French patriots to be on their guard, to be ready. The Patriot underground legions of France have actually been ordered to stand by for a flash which would send them against the Germans as skillful saboteurs and Allied intelligence agents. The biggest military armadas in history have been gathered in British ports for months and months. Huge stockpiles of equipment and vast concentrations of men, Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Dutch, and many other nationalities, have been centered in British invasion bases. Allied broadcasts have warned for months past that the Germans might put out a false announcement of Allied invasion operations in an effort to bring Patriot French forces out into the open for annihilation. There's also the possibility that if the announcement is true, it is still only a diversion or a large-scale raid. The Allies have been planning invasion since soon after the British routed Dunkirk 4 years ago. The Tehran Conference with President Roosevelt, Mr. Churchill, and Premier Stalin also declared that the Allies would launch an invasion from the west. The Germans have picked two ace commanders, Field Marshals von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Rommel, to face the threatened Allied tide in the west. The Allies have not expected a major German counterblow to develop after any Allied invasion until several days after the initial Allied troops fight their way ashore. In an amphibious operation of such gigantic size and complexity, it's been expected that the Germans would hold their main forces in reserve until it was determined where the major Allied force would strike. The reported blow against the main Axis-fortified western wall is a little more than 4 years after the British retreat from Dunkirk. Whether deception or not, the reported landing again set in motion Germany's bristling defense garrisons. This port of Le Havre, which is talked about so much in the German claims, is one of the most important ports in all of France, in fact, in all of Europe. It has great dock areas which would be suitable for an Allied invasion once they were seized. Now, just to summarize, 3 German news agencies in the early hours of this morning flashed word to the world that an Allied invasion of western France had begun, that it had begun with Allied parachute troops spilling out of the skies just about dawn over the Normandy coast. The Germans also claim that seaborne forces landed in the Le Havre area. They also said that Allied warships were furiously bombarding the big German-held French port of Le Havre, which is just 100 miles west of Paris.
From the NBC newsroom in New York and in Washington, the National Broadcasting Company has brought its listeners a commentary on the German report of Allied landings in France. The commentaries by Robert St. John, Richard Harkness, and Morgan Beatty. The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night in view of the important but so far unconfirmed reports from overseas. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
London Radio has just issued a warning from the Supreme Allied Commander advising the French people to leave the entire coastline of France. And here's another bulletin, also from London, which says, the German military commentator, Captain Ludwig Sertorius, made the first comment on the reported invasion today. He said, the great contest between the Reich and the Anglo-Americans has begun, which incidentally are not confirmed by the Allies, reports that German warships are fighting Allied landing ships around the Seine estuary just 80 miles from the South England coast, and that Allied paratroopers are being landed in France. That bulletin comes from the United Press.
The National Broadcasting Company will continue its network service throughout the remainder of the night. There'll be a full 5-minute period of news, so stay tuned to your NBC station for further details. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
From the NBC newsroom in New York, we are bringing you coverage of tonight's announcement from German radio stations and news agencies, the announcement that the Allied forces are making landings on the continent of Europe. There have been no efforts on the part of the Allied command to confirm or to deny these reports. Because of the importance of keeping the nation informed on the developments of the night, the National Broadcasting Company will continue to give service to its nationwide network of stations for the remainder of the night. Ordinarily, this is the hour when our stations sign off for the evening. We will continue transmission over the entire network of NBC's 146 affiliated stations. And now for a summary of the news tonight, here is NBC's former overseas reporter and commentator, Robert St. John.
Before we go into the German reports, let me tell you all that London has said so far. Not long ago, London radio warned the French people to leave the coastline to a depth of 22 miles and to keep off the roads, to avoid crowds, and to keep in the country and in the woods. That broadcast followed, by just a short time, another broadcast to the people of Holland, in which they were warned that if they lived within 18 miles of the coast, they should leave their homes and keep off the roads and the railroads and bridges. And then, from London, comes a bulletin which we can believe, a bulletin that Londoners were awakened in the early hours of this morning by the roar of planes. Londoners and the people on the coast of England saw the largest force of bombers and fighters ever to take the air, saw them sailing away across the Channel to Europe. And then here's a bulletin which says that Luxembourg radio has announced that Allied planes are over Germany. And now let's review what's happened so far. Shortly after midnight, 3 German news agencies began broadcasting reports that the Allies had started the invasion of northern France this morning. But, let me repeat, there is no confirmation of this from any Allied source so far. At this hour, it's impossible to know whether the enemy report is true or not. The first German report came shortly after midnight Eastern wartime. It told of German warships battling enemy landing barges at Le Havre, the French port at the mouth of the river Seine. This was followed quickly by a second German report that the invasion had begun with operations by Allied airborne troops and Allied ships around Le Havre. A series of bulletins from German sources then gave further alleged details. They said that Allied airborne troops were landing along the coast all the way from the mouth of the river Seine, where it empties into the English Channel, to the area of the Normandy Peninsula, which is approximately the Belgian coast. One German report said that Allied landings were being made in the area of the Somme River estuary, which is about midway along the French coast from the Seine mouth to the Belgian border. But let me emphasize that all this has been coming from the Germans. From the Allied side, there has been no announcement hinting at an invasion. One broadcast by the British told the French people that leaflets would be dropped warning them of which towns were to be raided, possibly 1 hour beforehand. The French were told that they would get all the instructions they needed from these leaflets. Strangely enough, while Berlin has been doing all this talking about invasion, insisting that this is D-Day, strangely enough, Paris radio has said nothing at all about this Allied invasion. Here's a bulletin from Washington which says the executive director of overseas broadcasting for OWI says, "We don't touch a thing unless and until it is announced officially." And nothing has been announced officially so far.
This report has come to you from Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, the National Broadcasting Company is announcing to its stations over the country that the entire network will be kept open beyond our usual closing hour. We will continue broadcasting throughout the night. Stay tuned to your NBC station for complete coverage. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Berlin Radio has just said that combined British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre. Now, that's a distance of about 60 miles, but remember, there is no Allied confirmation of this report. And here's another bulletin from London, United Press. The German DNB agency said today in a broadcast, which is unconfirmed from Allied sources, that 6 heavy warships and 20 destroyers are lying before the Seine estuary off the coast of France. I presume that they mean Allied warships and Allied destroyers. And now here's a bulletin, an Allied bulletin, giving us details of that broadcast made a little earlier in the morning by a spokesman for General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This spokesman told the people in the broadcast, the people living on Europe's invasion coast, that a new phase of the Allied air offensive has started, and he warned them to move inland to a depth of 35 kilometers, or about 22 miles. Now, listen to the interesting wording of this set of instructions. Quote, "A new phase of the air offensive has started. It will affect the entire coastal zone situated not less than 35 kilometers inland from the French coast. People will be advised by special announcements dropped from Allied planes. The attack will take place not less than 1 hour later. As soon as the warning has been given, the following orders are to be followed. First, leave the town at once. Second, choose such a route out of town as to avoid the main road. Third, leave on foot, only carrying essentials. Fourth, go to the country at least 2 kilometers from town. Do not assemble in groups which might appear to be troop concentrations." The broadcast then advised the people to keep as far as possible away from roads and railroad lines and to take nothing with them which they could not carry personally. The spokesman concluded this broadcast to the people of Europe living along the invasion coast with the advice that those able to leave the 35-kilometer coastal belt should do so at once, adding that those who cannot leave now must do so when the Allies give warning. This is a special bulletin brought to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, we may be approaching a fateful hour. All night long, bulletins have been pouring in from Berlin claiming that D-Day is here, claiming that the invasion of Western Europe has begun. Let me read you several of the latest bulletins. One says that a report, unconfirmed by Allied sources, of course, says that heavy fighting is taking place between the Germans and invasion forces on the Normandy Peninsula, about 31 miles southwest of Le Havre. Another bulletin, also from Berlin Radio and unconfirmed, says that British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and from the air, are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre, a distance of about 60 miles. I repeat, there is no confirmation. And here's another bulletin just in. DNB, the German agency, says, this is unconfirmed, that the most important aerodromes in the area of the Normandy Peninsula of France have been wiped out. Now, I presume that means wiped out by the Allies. As you may have heard on earlier broadcasts, all three German news agencies have begun broadcasting these stories that the invasion is here. But there is no Allied confirmation as yet. The first report came out shortly after midnight, and since then we've been flooded with reports from Berlin. Paris radio, strangely enough, has not confirmed any of these reports. And now we have just been informed that we can expect in a very few seconds, a very important broadcast from the British capital. And so now we take you to London.
Expeditionary Force. The text of Communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of Communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is New York, NBC Newsroom again. Men and women of the United States, this is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe, the 0 hour of the Second Front. The men of General Dwight Eisenhower are leaving their landing barges, fighting their way up the beaches into the fortress of Nazi Europe. They are moving in from the sea to attack the enemy under a mammoth cloud of fighter planes, under a ceiling of screaming shells from Allied warships. The first news flashes do not say, but a large proportion of this assault is believed to be in the hands of American men. They are making the attack side by side with the British Tommies who were bombed and blasted out of Europe at Dunkirk. Now, at this hour, they are bombing and blasting their way back again. This is the European front, once again being established in fire and blood, not only by the Americans and British, but by many allies in the fight against Axis aggression. This is the supreme test of Allied spirit and of Allied weapons. The world's greatest military undertaking is underway. Casualties in this mammoth operation, in the subsequent drive inland, may reach a dreadful toll. The German war machine is still powerful and is still strongly entrenched. Our invasion forces are on the offensive against Nazi troops who have been ordered to die rather than retreat. However, die or retreat they must, for this attack up the shores of Europe is being made with all the strength the Allied command can throw into battle. Eisenhower, the commander, has promised that his men will bring victory in Europe in 1944. The first aim of the Americans and the British will be to secure their beachheads, and then the capture or building of airfields so that our planes from European bases can carry on the task of blasting loose the enemy from his prepared positions farther back. That task now is assigned to our planes flying out of England right now. And you have already heard the flash that came from London. The flash, the official Allied announcement that the invasion of Western Europe has begun, that D-Day is here, that H hour has struck. Air power paved the way for this mighty assault in the West. Nazi targets have been hammered day and night in an offensive which has steadily grown in destructive violence. Thousands of planes each day have flown cross-channel up from Italy and Africa to tear up German gun emplacements which have been 4 years in the making. Airfields have been knocked out of operation, and the German Air Force, with its wings very badly clipped, has been based farther and farther inland, closer and closer to the German homeland itself. And now, let me go on a little bit more. These Allied air blows were methodically driven home to prepare the way for amphibious assault.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a special broadcast, we take you to London, England.
Wolf. 10 seconds. Stand by. 8 seconds. 5 seconds. Stand by. 3, 2.
The following is the order of the day, issued today by General Eisenhower to each individual of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force. You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeat in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. This order was distributed to assault elements after their embarkation. It was read by appropriate commanders to all other troops in the Allied Expeditionary Force. I return you now to the United States.
Broadcasters, is everyone taking the official program starting at 47? This is McCall speaking. Yes.
Got a stopwatch. Click this. Stick it in front of me. All right, sir. Good morning, everybody. We have just had the first communique from General Eisenhower's headquarters on the invasion. Here is its text. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. And we have also had the first order of the day, the one issued by General Eisenhower, wishing Godspeed to his troops as they left the shores of Britain for the shores of northern France. He told them that they were about to embark on the great crusade. He reminded them that the eyes of the world are upon them, that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere in the world are with you. He warned them that the task which they confront is not easy, that the enemy will fight savagely. And he urged upon them devotion to duty, perseverance in the task, and asked the blessing of God upon the great enterprise that the liberty-loving peoples of the world have undertaken this morning. The attack is against northern France. That much we have known as a result of the German bulletins which have been pouring in upon us all morning. It is only natural that the Germans should report first, since they are the objects of our attack, since they naturally feel its force before we feel prepared to announce it to the world. But now it is official. We know that the long delay, the anxious days and weeks through which we have all passed are over. The great adventure has begun. The final chapter in the history of the Second World War is being written. Here is what the Germans have told us thus far about the invasion. Early this morning, and I am now quoting the German bulletin, numerous landing craft and light warships were observed in the area between the mouth of the Seine and the eastern coast of Normandy. That is the northern part of France. It is north of the Channel to some extent, south of the Channel for part of the way. Remember that Gravelines, Calais, Boulogne are just about halfway between
5 seconds, stand by for a full broadcast.
Here is the text of a report sent to London by Herbert M. Clark for the networks of the United States. This is Herbert M. Clark in a takeoff report from an Allied expeditionary base. I don't have to explain what the takeoff is. When you hear this, you'll know that Allied forces have leaped the gap between the bases in the United Kingdom and the coast of France. We'll be there, and we'll be there to stay as you listen. As I write this, we're in an unnamed port on an unnamed coast, one of the quirks of military security. But it's a funny thing about security. A week ago in London, I was in a state of constant irritation with security censorship. It was obvious from German radio reports that the Nazis knew things we knew but couldn't say. Since then, I've been living and eating and sleeping aboard the flagship of an Allied assault force, one of the several which are going to hit the Hun where he hurts most. And I find that Jerry knows less than he said he did. Since I've been here, we've had exactly one air alarm, and that not a raid or even a determined reconnaissance. And I also find that I don't object so much to security. My loyalty and responsibility to you back home is overridden by loyalty and responsibility to the soldiers on this boat and the sailors who are carrying them to the beachhead. That objective is also, for the moment, unidentifiable, because the place we've picked for our main landing is one Jerry hadn't figured on. And I don't want to be the one to tell him that our sector is the one where his counterattack should go. The Nazis have been badly outguessed on this whole show. He's going to be surprised by the direction of the attack, and he's going to get a shock by the timing. The master race has fallen down again. I'm treating all this in the past tense as though it had already happened. Maybe that's a mistake, but it's a reflection of the overwhelming confidence of the troops involved and the confidence I've drawn from the tremendous scale of the preparations. We haven't yet moved from our anchorage, but all morning this coastal strip has been full of movement. Ladies and gentlemen, I will digress to say that the next few sentences will be semi-English. That script has been censored. There are ships in the task forces which are striking, British, Canadian, and American. They range from big troop carriers and supply ships down to landing craft. Other vessels, landing craft, which make most of the journey, piggyback on bigger ships, are in the fleet. Now I admit that I can't conceive of a fleet of ships myself, but I do know that's as far as I can see from the bridge of this ship. Others are dotting the water thickly, and I can see about 30 square miles of water. Well, ships, I'm told, half the force. Double it, and you'll have the whole. And they're all loaded with fighting men and fighting weapons, some of them still secret. For some hours, the vanguard of our force, assigned to deal with specific coastal objectives, in our sector of Nazi Europe, and landing craft lumbering through a choppy sea so slowly that they must start well ahead of time to get to their assigned places at their appointed times. These ships have been moving out. I'm speaking to shore by the last available channel of communication. We'll be following those ships soon, and I hope to be back with you before long with some harder facts. This is Herbert Clark reporting from the flagship of an Allied assault invasion force for the networks of the United States. I return you now to the United States.
This is Robert St. John in the NBC newsroom in New York. An announcement has just been made by Supreme Allied Headquarters in London. It says, it is announced that General B.L. Montgomery is in command of the Army Group carrying out the assault. That is, the assault on France. This Army Group includes British, Canadian, and American forces. Many of these troops, of course, storming the first barriers on the road to Rome, to Berlin, probably are American, Yanks from the farms of the Middle West, from the plains of the cow country, and from the streets of New York, and from the deep South. One estimate was that perhaps 70% of Eisenhower's invasion force would be American, with the British and the Canadians and the men of the other United Nations furnishing the balance. This estimate was based on the fact that Britain lacked the reserves in her home islands to send an equal number of men into the assault. Because the invasion of Europe is primarily an American invasion, it is commanded by Dwight Eisenhower of Kansas, with, as I just told you, British General Montgomery in command of the Army Group carrying out the actual assault. At least 4 million Americans are on the fighting fronts overseas, and a large proportion of them have been concentrated in the British Isles. In the vast movements overseas, which began a short time after Pearl Harbor, brought us into the war. Both here at home and along the coasts of England, American troops have been trained under actual battle conditions for D-Day, H-hour, which has now actually arrived. Recently, they completed a large-scale rehearsal for invasion over there in Britain, a rehearsal during which they went ashore with naval guns thundering overhead, with aerial bombs exploding in...
And once again, ladies and gentlemen, for a special report, we take you to London.
This is the last alerting announcement. In 10 seconds, the broadcast will be made from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. In a moment, you will hear the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His statement will be followed by other messages to the peoples of the countries on the western coast of Europe, which are occupied by the enemy.
The Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe, made in conjunction with our great Russian allies. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching. All patriots, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory. To members of resistance movements, whether led by nationals or by outside leaders, I say, follow the instructions you have received. To patriots who are not members of organized resistance groups, so continue your passive resistance, but do not needlessly endanger your lives. Wait until I give you the signal to rise and strike the enemy. The day will come when I shall need your united strength. Until that day, I call on you for the hard task of discipline and restraint. Citizens of France, I am proud to have again under my command the gallant forces of France. Fighting beside their allies, they will play a worthy part in the liberation of their homeland. Because the initial landing has been made on the soil of your country, I I repeat to you with even greater emphasis my message to the peoples of other occupied countries in Western Europe. Follow the instructions of your leaders. A premature uprising of all Frenchmen may prevent you from being of maximum help to your country during a critical hour. Be patient. Prepare. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, there is imposed on me the duty and responsibility of taking all measures necessary to the prosecution of the war. Prompt and willing obedience to the orders that I shall issue is essential. Effective civil administration of France must be provided by Frenchmen. All persons must continue in their present duties unless otherwise instructed. Those who have made common cause with the enemy and so betrayed their country will be removed. When France is liberated from her oppressors, you yourselves will choose your representatives and the government under which you wish to live. In the course of this campaign for the final defeat of the enemy, we may sustain further loss and damage. Tragic though they may be, they are part of the price of victory. I assure you that I shall do all in my power to mitigate your hardship. I know that I can count on your steadfastness now, no less than in the past. To the heroic deeds of Frenchmen who have continued the struggle against the Nazis and their vicious satellites in France and throughout the French Empire have been an example and an inspiration to all of us. This man is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe. Great battles lie ahead. I call upon all who love freedom to stand with us now. Keep your faith staunch. Our arms are resolute. Together we shall achieve victory.
You have just heard the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
It has just been announced that General de Gaulle has arrived in England. He will broadcast a message to the people of France later in the day. You will next hear the King of Norway, His Majesty King Håkon VII.
Landsmenn, som led i den store strategiske plan, som har taget sigte på frigøring af Europas undertrykte folk, er krigen fra vest stærkt gået ind i en fase. Denne melding har vi alle modtaget med dyb taknemmelighed og glæde, fordi den indebærer vidsheden om, at de allierede styrker nu har ført os et godt stykke længere frem på vejen mod sejren og friheden. I glæden over denne udvikling må ikke vores tro gå til nogen forhastet eller uoverlagt handling. Men i tiden fremover bliver det af en endnu større betydning end før og lægge fjenden alle tænkelige hindringer i vejen. Det må ske på en slik måde, så ikke ved uforsigtighed udleverer sig selv eller andre. Medlemmerne af de organisationer, som samarbejder med de allieredes militære autoriteter, står i særskilt. De har fået sine bestemte opgaver at løse, og de vil få nye ordre. De vil udføre dem i fuldstændig kamp, og når de trænger skjulested, eller magt, eller lignende hjælp, vil de altid få. Også på den måde kan mange ressourcer komme til at yde en mere værdifuld indsats i frihedskampen. Jeg og min regering sender en varm hilsen til alle landsmænd, som står rank på sin post, og som offervilligt og tillidsfuldt ser fremme mod stadig mere krævende opgaver. De allierede styrkers overkommanderende vil på enhver tid sige fra om hvad han venter af alle, som står under hans kommando, og gennem kringkastning eller på anden måde vil vores folk virkelig og stå i kontakt
You are listening to the voice of King Haakon of Norway.
Met de dames te ønsker. De vil at de ikke besvikter vårt tillit. Og vi lover at vi aldrig besvikter dem. Landsmenn, hold sammen og vær beredt. Leve de forenede nationer sejr, leve frihed.
Here is a translation of King Haakon's message to the people of Norway.
Fellow countrymen, as a link of the great strategic plan which aims at liberating the oppressed people of Europe, the war in the West has today entered a new phase. We have all received this news with a profound feeling of joy and satisfaction, as we realize that Allied forces have thereby carried us a good way further on the road to victory and liberation. Heartened by these developments, our people must not allow their enthusiasm to lead them into premature or unpremeditated acts. From now on, however, it will be of even greater importance than heretofore to hinder and impede the enemy by all subtle and covert means that do not expose yourself or others. This order does not apply to organized resistance groups who are in touch with the Allied military authorities. They have been given their special orders, and they will receive further orders. These they will carry out in the knowledge that if they are in need of a hiding place, or food, or any other help, they will always find it. In this way also, many of you will be able quietly to take an effective part in the battle for freedom. I and my government warmly salute all compatriots who stand firm at their posts and who look forward to ever more exacting tasks in a spirit of self-sacrifice and confidence. The Supreme Allied Commander will at all times keep you informed about what is expected of everyone under his command. And over the radio and by other means, our people will continue to be in close contact with their constitutional authorities. We salute the forces which have now gone into battle. Our thoughts and warmest wishes go with them. We know that they will not fail us, and we promise never to fail them. Fellow countrymen, keep together and be prepared. Long live the cause of the United Nations. Long live the cause of freedom. That ends the translation of King Haakon's statement. Communique number 1, issued by Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, will now be repeated.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
You will now have the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, His Excellency Professor Brandy.
Mannen en vrouwen van Nederland. Nu het grote ogenblik gekomen is waarop de geallieerde strijdkrachten tot een machtige aanval zijn overgegaan vanuit het westen, heb ik enkele zeer ernstige woorden tot u te zeggen. Ik verzoek u hiernaar met de grootst mogelijke aandacht te luisteren en mijn woorden met inachtneming van alle noodzakelijke veiligheidsmaatregelen door te geven aan de betrouwbare landgenoten die niet in de gelegenheid waren naar mij te luisteren. Landgenoten, nu de geallieerde motorslag neerkomt op Hitler Atlantic Wall, gaat door ons allen een siddering van ontroering. Onze mannen van leger, vloot, luchtmacht en koopvaardij hebben de taak te vervullen welke aan hen door de militairen opperbevelhebber is toebedeeld. In de harten van ons allen steekt het dringende beden op tot den Almachtige om hulp en bijstand in deze vooral zo rechtvaardige strijd. In nauw overleg met de geallieerde opperbevelhebber geef ik u daarom de volgende orders, waaraan ik verwacht dat iedere Nederlander die van goede wille is, zich zal houden. Mijn orders richten zich niet tot die speciale verzetsgroepen die hun eigen orders hebben ontvangen en daaraan gevolg zullen geven. Ik richt mijn instructies tot hen die niet lid zijn van die speciale verzetsgroepen. 1. Hij zal geen daden van gewelddadig openlijk verzet plegen. Het zou den wrede vijand slechts de gelegenheid bieden represailles te nemen, veel en veel bloediger dan ooit tevoren. 2. Zij die redeneren dat ze gaarne hun leven veil hebben en zich dus niet willen laten weerhouden van iedere vorm van directe hulpverlening, zij op het hart gebonden dat de represailles zich zouden uitstrekken over vele onschuldigen. Wij kennen den Duitser. En ik herhaal dus met klem, geen gewelddadig openlijk verzet. 3. Wat daarentegen wel geschieden moet is, overal waar onzichtbaar en onherkenbaar actief verzet mogelijk is, moet het onverbiddelijk worden geboden. 4. Daarnaast dient hij alles na te laten wat een vijand van enig direct of indirect voordeel zou kunnen zijn. 5. De vijand zal geen enkel middel verzuimen om u te provoceren of te misleiden. Wees overal waar hij staat of staat op uw hoede. Luister alleen naar de aanwijzingen die wij van hieruit geven. 6. Zodra van u een krachtiger actie wordt verwacht, zal dit op een onmiskenbare wijze van hieruit worden duidelijk gemaakt. Nederlanders, bid met ons om de zegen. Leve het vaderland.
Here is a translation of the statement just made by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Men and women of the Netherlands, now that the great moment has arrived and the Allied forces have started the mighty attack from the west, I have some very solemn words to say to you. I request you to listen with the greatest possible attention and, with due observance of all necessary security measures, to pass on my words to trustworthy compatriots who have not been in a position to listen to me. Fellow countrymen, now that the Allied sledgehammer blow is falling on Hitler's Atlantic wall, we are all thrilled with emotion. Our men of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Merchant Navy have to fulfill the task allotted to them by the military commander-in-chief. In the hearts of all of us rises the urgent prayer to the Almighty for help and assistance in what is for us so righteous a struggle. In close deliberation with the Allied High Command, I therefore give you the following orders, which I expect every Dutchman of goodwill to keep. These orders do not apply to those organized resistance groups who have received their orders and who will obey them. It is to those who are not members of organized resistance groups that I address these instructions. 1. You will not perpetrate any acts of violent, open resistance. It would only offer the cruel enemy an opportunity to take far bloodier reprisals than ever before. 2. Those who reason that they are ready to sacrifice their life and therefore do not wish to refrain from any form of direct assistance are urged to consider that the reprisals would extend to a great many innocent people. We know the Germans. And I therefore request, with emphasis, no violent open resistance. 3. This, however, must be done. Wherever invisible and unrecognizable passive resistance is possible, it must be inexorably forthcoming. 4. Apart from this, you must refrain from any act that might be of any direct or indirect advantage to the enemy. 5. The enemy will not fail to employ any means of provoking or deceiving. Wherever you go, wherever you may be, watch your own behavior. Listen, all of you, to the instructions which we give you from here. 6. As soon as more forceful action is required of you, this will be made clear from here in unmistakable fashion. Dutchmen, pray with us for victory. Long live the fatherland. That ends the translation of the statement made by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. You will next hear the Prime Minister of Belgium, His Excellency, Monsieur Hubert Pierlot.
Mes chers compatriotes, l'heure attendue par vous est proche. Les opérations préliminaires pour la libération de l'Europe ont commencé. Cet assaut initial est l'annonce certaine de votre délivrance. Vous allez vivre des jours difficiles, dans une attente anxieuse. C'est le moment de montrer une fois de plus les qualités de discipline et de maîtrise de vous-même dont vous avez donné tant d'exemples depuis 4 ans. La première règle à suivre sera de modérer votre impatience. La seconde, de ne pas vous laisser tromper par les excitations perfides de l'ennemi et de ne pas vous laisser engager dans des actions prématurées qui ne pourraient avoir pour résultat que de terribles représailles. Les Alliés vous sont reconnaissants de la magnifique résistance que vous avez montrée sous l'oppression allemande et le gouvernement est convaincu que vous ferez tout ce qui est possible pour contribuer à détraquer la machine de guerre de l'ennemi. Le succès final de l'effort militaire aujourd'hui commencé dépend en grande partie de la force que vous conserverez pour le moment décisif. Vous souhaiteriez que nous vous demandions tout de suite tout l'effort dont vous êtes capable. Mais une résistance organisée, déjà en possession de ses consignes, et le sabotage clandestin sont maintenant plus utiles. À tous les patriotes, je dis, obéissez avec une discipline complète à tous les ordres qui vous seront donnés par le commandement suprême allié et par votre gouvernement. Mais soyez attentifs à décerner les fausses consignes qui pourraient être lancées par l'ennemi. Ne croyez pas les rumeurs non contrôlées. La seule façon de vérifier l'authenticité des nouvelles est de vous assurer qu'elles sont transmises par les stations de télégraphie sans fil des Alliés. Par-dessus tout, méfiez-vous des agents provocateurs. Le moment du suprême combat n'est pas encore venu. Lorsqu'il aura sonné, vous en serez avertis par le commandement allié et par votre gouvernement. L'on vous dira alors clairement ce que l'on attend de vous. Utilisez cette période intermédiaire pour perfectionner vos organisations afin qu'au moment voulu, leur action soit pleinement efficace. Dans les souffrances accrues qui marqueront peut-être la dernière phase de la guerre,
while you are listening to the leaders of the refugee governments in London talking to their own people, a few hours after the start of the invasion, some important bulletins have been coming in. Let me read you several of them before we go back to London. The German news agency DNB has just said in a broadcast that Anglo-American troops were reinforced at dawn at the mouth of the River Seine in the Le Havre area. And here's another one. German radio says that fierce fighting between Nazis and Allied forces is taking place 10 miles inland from the Normandy coast. 10 miles inland. Allied progress has been rapid so far. Already, apparently, our forces have pierced Allied defenses to a depth of 10 miles. And now back to London.
This first assault is the certain signal for your deliverance. You are going to undergo difficult days in a period of anxious waiting. This is the time to show once again those qualities of discipline and self-control which for 4 years you have so often displayed. The first rule for you to follow is to moderate your impatience. The second is not to let yourselves be fooled by any of the enemy's treacherous provocations, and not to let yourselves be embroiled in any premature action which could result in terrible reprisals. The Allies are grateful to you for the magnificent resistance that you have shown under German oppression. And the government is convinced that you will do everything possible to contribute to the overthrow of the German war machine. The final success of the military undertaking which began today depends largely on the strength that you can serve for the decisive moment. You naturally want us to demand of you immediately all the effort of which you are capable. But the organized resistance, which already has its orders, and clandestine sabotage are at this moment of more use. To all patriots, I say, obey with complete discipline all the orders given you by the Supreme Allied Command and by your government. But be on the alert for false orders, which might be issued by the enemy. Do not believe uncontrolled rumors. The only way to check the genuineness of any news is to make sure it is issued from Allied radio stations. Above all, trust agent provocateur. The moment of supreme combat has not yet come. When it does, you will be warned of it by the Allied command and by your government. You will then be clearly told what is expected of you. Use the period that intervenes to perfect your organizations so that at the desired moment, their action may be fully effective. In the increased suffering, which perhaps will mark the last phase of the war, all Belgians must, more than ever before, show their devotion to each other and use all resources still available to relieve the suffering of those most sorely tried. The watchwords we send you are courage, discipline, unity, and confidence. That ends the translation of the Belgian Prime Minister's statement.
Communique number 1, issued from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, will now be repeated.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
This concludes the broadcast from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
This is the Home and Overseas Service of the
You have been listening to a broadcast from London. During that broadcast, leaders of the refugee governments in London have been talking to their own people in Europe, talking to them just a few hours after the start of the Allied invasion. They have been giving them instructions on how to help the Allied armies, instructions against getting panicky, against crowding the roads, instructions to get away from the beaches as soon as possible. And while that broadcast was going on, bulletins have been coming in to our NBC newsroom here in New York.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we pause briefly for station identification.
Your station is WEAF, New York.
During the course of the last hour or so, on these broadcasts that we've been hearing from London, you have heard a statement by General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of this great operation which has begun in the early hours of the morning. You have heard a statement in which General Eisenhower has addressed the people of Western Europe. In that statement, he said, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. He repeated that statement several times in the course of his statement. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France, and German radio stations admit that our troops are now 10 miles inside Europe. That apparently means, as I said a minute ago, that we have broken the first German defense line. We've pierced a hole in it. We are 10 miles inside the fortress of Europe, that wall of steel and concrete which Hitler boasted could never be broken. But it apparently has already been broken. And now, here is another statement by General Eisenhower, an order of the day to his soldiers, in which he told them that they are embarking on a great crusade. A crusade which he said must and will end in victory. The commander warned his men that they are facing a very tough and a very well-prepared enemy, but he told them that victory would be theirs, the victory they've been preparing for and working for and striving for so many months over there in England.
Now, for the first eyewitness report of action along the channel by NBC's own battle reporter, Wright Bryan, we again take you overseas.
This is Wright Bryan speaking from London. In the first hour of D-Day by British double summer time, or a little more than an hour before D-Day began by Greenwich Mean Time, the first spearhead of Allied forces for the liberation of Europe landed by parachute in northern France. In the navigator's dome in the flight deck of a C-47, I rode across the English Channel with the first group of planes from Troop Carrier Command to take our fighting men into Europe. Just before we left French soil for the return trip to England, I watched from the rear door of our plane, named the Snooty, as 17 American paratroopers, led by Lieutenant Colonel, jumped with their arms, ammunition, and equipment into German-occupied France. Our group, at the head of the leading wing from the U.S. 9th Air Force's Troop Carrier Command, was met with only scattering small arms fire from the fields, which were dark and quiet as we entered enemy territory. As we headed back towards the English coast, we saw tracers arching through the air behind us and a steady parade of Allied planes moving out over the course we had just navigated to strengthen the ground forces we had left below. In the channel below us, we could see a few ships, but could not be certain whether they were part of the armada carrying Allied soldiers to the beaches or attacks which were quickly following the first landings of airborne troops which I had witnessed. For 2 days, I had been living with the Troop Carrier Squadron commanded by Major Clement G. Richardson of Salinas, California. His combat crews had been fully briefed as to their initial mission, the course they would fly, and all procedures they would follow. From the moment this briefing began, the combat crews lived apart from the ground personnel of their base, with barbed wire surrounding their quarters and guards protecting them from any contact with outside persons. All day Monday, they watched the weather. After an early supper, they broke up into small groups for volleyball games in their small recreation area. In the early evening, Major Richardson returned from a conference with Lieutenant Colonel Donaldson of Birmingham, Alabama, commanding this lead group. As Major Richardson came within the barbed wire enclosure of his own squadron, he blew a long, shrill blast on his whistle. The pilots, co-pilots, navigators, and radio men clustered around him. "Come into the briefing room," he said. There he stood in front of a large-scale map on which the course was plotted. As quickly as his men were all in the room, Major Richardson said, "Do you know your stuff?" There was no word of dissent spoken. Said Major Richardson, "Get your stuff and report to the operations room immediately. I'm going down to the colonel to get the weather report. I think this is it. Good luck." The crews began to file out of the room, but Major Richardson stopped them. "You want to get back, don't you?" he asked. There was a quick murmur of assent. "Then, damn it, get in there and fight." The crews piled in their trucks to go first to the operations office and then to the line where their planes were drawn up and ready to go. As they moved towards the airport proper, they passed long columns of airborne troops, trudging slowly under their full loads of battle equipment from the bivouac area where they had been camped awaiting this day toward the planes which would carry them into battle. General Eisenhower had visited this camp during the afternoon, quietly passing among the men and chatting with them, asking them names and their homes and their jobs. Outside the door of each C-47, the soldiers assembled and checked their equipment, while ground crews and combat crews gave the planes a final tuning up. Heavily laden transport planes began taxiing along in long procession toward the runway. As the first squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel David Daniel of Birmingham, Alabama, began to take off, the planes rushing in swift succession down the runway, Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton, the 9th Air Force commander, moved up and down the line of planes, giving the thumbs-up sign to his crews. Meantime, the paratroopers had adjusted their packs, donned their Mae Wests and chutes, and climbed into the planes. Each was so heavily loaded that he had to be pushed from behind and pulled from above to get up the steps into the plane. In our plane, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole of San Antonio, Texas, the senior officer aboard, moved quietly up and down the passenger compartment, speaking to each man and asking if he had everything he needed. As the men settled in their bucket seats, Colonel Cole said, "The doc is going to give you some pills to guard against air sickness. Make yourselves as comfortable as you can. Better try to sleep a little." Quiet settled in the plane. These men had done their talking. Now they were grim and silent. The soldier sitting farthest forward on the port side, Private Robert C. Hillman of Manchester, Connecticut, said, "I know my chute's okay because my mother checked it. She worked in the Pioneer Parachute Company in our town, and her job is giving the final once-over to all chutes they manufacture." On the flight deck of our plane, the Snooty, Lieutenant John E. Peters of Chicago, the pilot, and Lieutenant B.E. Maxwell of Clave, Michigan, muttered soft curses as their motors were slow to start after a long pause on the taxi strip. But when the engines did turn over, they droned steadily and powerfully. Almost before we knew it, we were trundling along past the operations buildings and the control tower, where all the ground personnel of the base were standing. Some held thumbs up. Some made the V sign. Some waved. It was like the takeoff of a big mission from a bomber station, only more so. This was the first combat mission for this outfit, and everyone on the base knew that this was the day. Our ship was leading the second section of the second squadron in the first group. As we picked up speed on the long runway, I stood between the pilot and co-pilot and watched formation lights of the ships ahead of us slowly, almost imperceptibly climbing, then gradually swinging into wide circles. "This thing is really loaded down," said Pilot Pete, and as we became airborne, you could almost feel the sturdy transport strengthening its muscles and shouldering its burden. Then, foot by foot, almost inch by inch, rising above the fields and trees of southern England. As our squadron fell into its formation, 3 Vs of 3 ships each in the first section and 3 Vs of 3 ships each in the second section, which we were leading, The preceding squadron was already circling the home field, now gaining altitude more rapidly. Other squadrons followed us. Soon the entire group was in the air. All about us and below us was such a glimmering fabric of lights as I had not seen in the 8 months I had been in blacked-out England. 4 times we circled the field, its runways and perimeter outlined in sparkling white lights. Through the sky, formation lights of the planes strung out almost to the limit of vision, looking for all the world like holiday decorations stretching down the length of any American main street. As the long procession straightened out on its pre-established course toward the shore of the English Channel, signal lights blinked, and navigators checked their speed and direction with the pilots and began their continuous plotting of position. As we headed toward the coast, the bulky transports silhouetted against the sky as they gently undulated in the prop wash of their companions. Reaching the first point for change of course, our plane blinked its signal light, and Pete said to his co-pilot, "Want to take it now, Maxie?" And Maxie took over the controls. "Right on course, and we're 1 minute early," reported Navigator Robert E. Taylor of Altoona, Pennsylvania. At that moment, I left the glass blister in the forward roof of the fuselage, sometimes called the astral globe, sometimes called the navigating dome, from which I had been watching the formations about me, too fascinated to feel the weight of the flak suit, which, like all crew members, I was wearing, or the steel helmet which I was pressing against the ceiling. Down the long passenger cabin, I walked to see how the paratroopers were riding. More than half of them had taken their colonel's advice and were dozing with their heads back against the wall and their feet stretched out in front of them. The others were sitting silently, except for 2 or 3 who talked among themselves in whispers. By the open rear door, Colonel Cole waited and said, "It's cold back here with the wind whipping in." I had been perspiring in the crew's cabin up front, but back where the colonel sat, I was glad I wore heavy clothing. More signal lights blinked as we crossed the coast of England and pushed out across the channel. The sea was calm, its steely grayness blending in the half-light with the dingier gray of the horizon. But soon the moon brightened the water and made the ripples below us twinkle. The ship on our wing, its heavy fuselage outlined against the water, but its wings obscured from my angle of vision, looked, but for the high tail fin, like a giant whale rising and falling in the easy swells. Halfway across the channel, planes one by one switched out their formation lights. "Where's all this fighter protection we were going to have?" muttered the pilot. We had not seen a plane outside our own formations, but the fighters must have done their work well, for there was no sign of enemy aircraft about. "Tiny, tell the colonel it's 30 minutes until jump time," yelled Pilot Pete. And the fat, husky crew chief, Staff Sergeant Richard A. Eberly of Indianapolis, whose father is a major in the Air Corps, shouldered his way back to give the word to Colonel Cole. And then, turning my eyes from the occasional lights and flares which glowed on the Channel Islands, I looked straight ahead and caught my first glimpse of the coast of France. I had never visited the continent of Europe in peacetime, and I was waiting for invasion day to visit it in wartime. The pilot and the co-pilot, too, were seeing this coast for the first time. None of us spoke, but each looked at the other. The navigation had been perfect. We could see the beach ahead of us precisely at the point we had studied it on maps, on aerial photographs, and on carefully modeled relief maps. The moon was almost full. Clouds were riding occasionally in front of it, but visibility was excellent. As our strong ship Snooty crossed above the breakers into the air of France, we plunged into a bank of cloud or fog and lost sight of the planes around us. For a matter of 2 or 3 minutes, we were flying formation on instruments. Then we emerged into clear moonlight, and below the rear door of the plane, almost close enough, it seemed, to step out without a parachute. The small fields looked peaceful with their orderly hedgerows. It almost seemed you could see the furrows. Now the paratroopers were on their feet, each adjusting his packs and snapping his ripcord over the static line, a cable which ran along the center of the cabin ceiling so that each chute would open automatically as its wearer jumped through the door. "You all set?" asked the colonel. "Get this thing hooked for me," he said, as he took his own place closest to the door. The jump lights, a small bank of signal lamps, were gleaming beside the door. They blinked as the pilot threw his switch, and before I could look up, they began jumping. I wanted to know how long it would take the 18 men to jump. I tried to count 101, 102, 103 to estimate the number of seconds. Before I had counted to 10 seconds, may have been 11 or 12, but no more, our passengers had left us, all but one of them. The paratroopers shoved each other so swiftly and heavily towards the open door that they jolted against the door frame. One man among the last half dozen hit the rear of the door so heavily that he was thrown into the back of the cabin and dazed. The men behind shoved him aside and went on jumping. Before the unhappy soldier could get to his feet, our plane was well past the drop zone, and in a matter of minutes it was back over the water and setting a course for home. It was too late, and that soldier had to return with us. He was unconsolable. He thought his comrades might think him yellow. The plane crew assured him that they would think no such thing, but he sat moody and glum all the way back and appealed for lonely instructions when he returned. As soon as I had watched the jumps from the rear door, I ran back to the front of the ship and looked straight back from the glass dome. Tiny streams of tracer bullets were curving upward from the ground, but they were well behind us. One of the pilots in our squadron had unwittingly left on his formation lights, and the tracers came closest to his wingtips. But we saw nothing that looked like heavy ack-ack except in the far distance. Our course had been well plotted and navigated to avoid the known German batteries. We were over France only 11 minutes. With our ships lightened by unloading their cargo, we picked up speed and streaked for home. Behind us, we could still see the tracers and an occasional flare. Below, a few more ships, but we couldn't tell just what they were. The Battle of Europe had begun, and our squadron had delivered the first Allied foot soldiers to their scene of action. This is right, Brian. This is right, Brian, in London, returning you to New York.
You have just been listening to NBC's war correspondent, Wright Bryan, the first man to come back from the invasion and make a report to America by air. Wright Bryan is from NBC's WSB in Atlanta, Georgia. He is also managing editor of the Atlanta Journal. And now here's a bulletin from Washington. Headquarters of the European Theater of Operations reports to the U.S. War Department that Allied aircraft covering the invasion are hitting any target which has any bearing on the strength of the armies at the front.
Ladies and gentlemen, the National Broadcasting Company has brought you the news to the moment. There'll be more news of vital importance to the world tonight, so stay tuned to your NBC station. Now, while we await further transmissions from overseas, we invite you to listen to the Star-Spangled Banner. Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem. Now we pause briefly for station identification.
WEAF, New York.
NBC further covers the news. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you the Dean of News Commentators, H.V. Kaltenborn.
We have already had a description of the first landings on French soil by American paratroopers. That tells us that the first spearhead paratroops landed approximately 15 miles from the coast of France. The plane carrying this spearhead was over France only 11 minutes, which would give them the opportunity of getting in approximately that distance. That agrees with all the other things that we have heard with regard to these early operations, for we have already had news that we are fighting the enemy some 10 miles from the French coast. That fighting, obviously, is not being carried on by troops that have landed from barges, but is carried on by the large number of paratroopers which have already been landed on the French coast, presumably in the vicinity of the mouth of the Seine, since, according to all reports from Germany that we have had thus far, some of the heaviest fighting is going on in that area. That is only natural, since our first operation would be destined to seize for the Allied forces one of the larger ports of France in order that our ships, our heavy ships, could get in to suitable landing facilities. Le Havre is the largest, best port in northern France, and it is only natural that it would be our objective, in spite of the fact that it is approximately 80 miles from the British coast instead of the shorter 20-mile distance directly across the Channel. Wright Bryan from London has just given us a description of how these first paratroopers, crossing over in their aerial transports, jumped out of the plane. He gave us a dramatic description of how 17 out of the 18 men jumped, and one who struck the door as he started to make the jump was dazed, and before he had recovered, the plane had passed the appointed place of landing, and consequently he could not drop. Only scattering small arms fire met these first planes. That is an indication that the Germans were not ready with anti-aircraft fire at all points along the coast, for obviously small arms fire is not likely to be effective against planes. There was a steady parade of these planes. We know that many, many thousands of paratroopers have been ready for D-Day, and all the paratroopers are likely to be thrown into action in the early hours, since they must pave the way for the landings that are to be made from barges. They must cut the communications. They must attempt to seize an airfield, for the seizure of an airfield is one of the first operations that are undertaken by paratroops, since if we once have one airfield, we can then make direct landings of troops in large numbers with gliders. We can establish an invasion center in the interior, and we are then prepared for the rapid development of the real invasion operations. There were no German fighter planes in sight as these first paratroopers approached. That is an indication of the extent to which our men, our flyers, have succeeded in eliminating German aerial opposition. That, too, is of good omen, for at the moment we are fairly sure that German aerial might will not be equal to meeting the crisis that faces them at this particular moment. We know from the broadcast of the Prime Minister of Belgium that Belgium is probably not to be invaded immediately. He warned against resistance, said that supreme combat for the Belgians has not yet arrived. We know that because of the landings made at various points, that the invasion is on a very large scale. We will have constant developments minute by minute from now on.
Thank you, Mr. Kaltenborn. And now we hear from another of NBC's reporters overseas. Here is John Vandercook speaking from London.
Announcement has just been made that the invasion of Western Europe has begun. The feints and diversions promised by Winston Churchill and hinted at by the military experts have now been relegated to the limbo of dead words. 4 million people will say today, this is really it. This is the Queen's move, straight across the board. The astronomical numbers of planes that for weeks past have been pulverizing rod by rod and yard by yard. Every German position from literally the beginning of shallow water to far within the hinterland of France have now, with close naval support, been followed by the paratroopers, the landing boats, the infantry. Beachhead is a narrow term. By all present indications, General Eisenhower and his field commander, the great Montgomery of Egypt and North Africa, have attacked along miles of the French coast. The textbook pattern of invasion, and this, of course, is the most massive such operation in all human history, calls for the early possession by the attacker of good seaports. The purpose of that is clear. A major offensive against an enemy-held coast requires, swiftly after its commencement, the possession by the initiators of the attack of harbors capable of the unloading of far weightier materiel than can be put ashore even by the incredibly versatile and numerous amphibian landing craft. That is probably an essential part of the Allied plan, as it is now being put in practice. Be sure of it, we are moving with the weight of mountains. In his order of the day issued to each man in the Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight Eisenhower calls this mighty mission the Great Crusade. He adds, the eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. General Eisenhower makes this solemn promise. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed people of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. And the Supreme Commander warns, the enemy will fight savagely. He is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. The final words of the General's orders have the lift that at this hour in England has raised every heart. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck. And let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. American, British, and Canadian forces under the direct command of General Bernard L. Montgomery are carrying out the first gigantic phase of the attack. The skies are ahum with the ceaseless passage of great planes that shuttle smoothly back and forth from the countless airfields of England to the scene of battle almost within eyesight of the British shore. The English ports are pouring cornucopias of the long-garnered riches of men and war machines that have been assembled through these many, many months for this long-awaited hour. I return you now to New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its coverage of this first step in the Allied liberation of Europe with a report from the Pentagon building in Washington.
We're speaking from the NBC broadcasting booth in the Pentagon building, the War Department's headquarters in Washington. NBC will broadcast from this nerve center of the Army of the United States in the days to come, prepared to give you day-by-day invasion news. Just a short while ago, the War Department issued a statement by General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force in the last war. General Pershing's statement says, and I quote, "American troops have landed in Western Europe. As the overmastering military might of the Allies advances, it will be joined by the men of the occupied countries, whose land has been overrun by the enemy, but whose spirit remains unconquered. 26 years ago, American soldiers, in cooperation with their allies, were locked in mortal combat with the German enemy. Their march of victory was never halted until the enemy laid down his arms in defeat. The American soldier of 1917 and 1918, fighting in a war of liberation, wrote by his deeds one of the most glorious pages of military history. Today, the sons of American soldiers of 1917 and 1918 are engaged in a like war of liberation. It is their task to bring freedom to peoples who have been enslaved. I have every confidence that they, together with their gallant brothers in arms, will win through to victory." And that's the text of a statement by General John J. Pershing, Commander-in-Chief of the 1st AEF. This is the Pentagon building, the massive structure across the Potomac River from Washington, which is the headquarters of the Army of the United States. Here is where the invasion was born. Here, and at a plain white building on the Washington side of the river, a heavily guarded building in which sit the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Pentagon is the largest office building in the world, only 3 stories tall, but its floor space is greater than the Empire State Building in New York, and rightly so. Here in the Pentagon are the offices of Secretary of War Stimson and Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall, and 35,000 other persons, Army officers and civilians. For years now, they've been working on invasion plans, not directly, but in their routine paperwork. In the midst of all the paraphernalia of a great military machine, the directives, the channels, and yes, even the red tape, the plans for D-Day were taking form. The invasion story broke at the Pentagon early this morning, while most of Washington was asleep across the Potomac. It was brought by newspaper and radio reporters who had been routed out of the bed by their offices. They descended on the Army Bureau of Public Relations like a flock of locusts. All they had to go on were German radio reports. A few, very few, Army officers sat around and said nothing. They answered all inquiries politely, but by the time you'd call your office to relay the word, you realized you'd learned nothing. It was calm in this gigantic 5-sided building throughout the night. There were a few lights burning in the Public Relations office and some others which had been burning all night in offices where unauthorized persons can't enter. Well, we sat and waited. The Germans did all the talking. And then came H hour, the moment of history. Army officers appeared with a flock of mimeographed sheets. There was a brief scramble as the reporters fought for a copy of the official communique, and then a mad race to telephones and broadcasting studios. It was official. In a few hours, the 35,000 workers at the Pentagon will come back to their jobs, and the daily routine will begin all over again. The official-looking forms, the long rows of filing cabinets, the thousands of clicking typewriters. For the Pentagon, it'll be another day as usual. D-Day is past. Now the long uphill drive begins. From the Pentagon building, we take you now to the NBC newsroom in Washington.
This is Richard Harkness in the NBC newsroom in Washington. The War Department, ladies and gentlemen, has just issued a bulletin. The War Department says that specially trained, picked assault teams of the United States Army made that initial attack on Fortress Europe, knocking out pillboxes and other fortifications of the vaunted Atlantic Wall. And then the War Department, in an official dispatch straight from a front-line town on the coast of England, tells us this story. The jump-off of Allied troops for the invasion of Europe began in a small way from that front-line town in England, which is yet unnamed. And the War Department report says that first, several advance parties of the assault troops marched into the landing stages of this port in England. They clambered aboard the blunt-nosed assault craft, and a little later climbed on the larger craft swinging at anchor farther out in the harbor.
We interrupt this program to take you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
For another overseas broadcast, the National Broadcasting Company takes you now to London.
Supreme Headquarters, I have just seen the first American troops preparing to storm ashore onto the continent of Europe. They were about to land on the north coast of France at 6:30 British summer time this morning. At 6:23, the Marauder bomber in which I was riding dropped the last load of bombs to be launched onto the coastal targets before H hour a few minutes later, when our landing barges would strike the shore. All night and from dawn onwards, thousands of Allied planes have been softening up a strip of coast. Already, several thousand paratroopers are waiting further inland to join forces with the landing parties. These airborne troops were flown in last night. I could see evidence of the landings in a number of parachutes lying in the little fields. But I must say at once, the amazing feature of my flight this morning was the almost unbelievable quietness of the scene below, where in the next few days, maybe in the next few hours, decisive battles for the reconquest of Europe will be fought. For with the exception of German tanks, which are moving up the roads towards the beachhead or hiding in hedges, we saw no signs of enemy resistance. As our flight of 54 Marauders made their bomb run along the enemy coast, we were met by only a few puffs of inaccurate flak, and by machine gun fire, machine guns firing from 40 to 50 German tanks. I'd like to record here that Sergeant Paul Scott of Cedartown, Georgia, the waist gunner beside whom I was riding, promptly turned his machine guns on the one German tank by a crossroads and claims to have set it on fire. I saw the tank burning. Apart from those tanks, a few bursts of flak, and one report of a coastal battery, I saw no signs of the enemy. Everything that flew in the air or sailed on the sea was definitely and overwhelmingly ours. You'll have to forgive the superlatives, but they're an accurate description of the facts in this case. The air and sea armadas I saw this morning were the biggest nations at war have ever launched at one time. At briefing, before we took off at dawn, the pilots were told to stay below 6,000 feet over England, because that was the level assigned them. Higher up and lower down, the air was full of other planes, fortresses, Liberators, Lightnings, Thunderbolts, Spitfires, all forming up before flying south to the same target we were headed for. I could see hundreds of planes crossing and crisscrossing below us, and the pilots of our ship called out over the intercom telephone, "There are planes strung out ahead and behind us like strings of sausages." Even more incredible was what we could see on the water, 3,000 feet below us. Ships were moving from the coast of England in immense convoys. In some convoys, the ships were sailing in single file. In others, they were in various patterns. From above, they looked like water beetles scuttling backwards and forwards over a pond. The sea was calm with occasional white caps. We left these vast convoys and passed over them for a long time. There were literally ships as far as the eye could reach, and it can reach a long way from 5,000 feet up. We crossed enemy territory at 6:18 and began our bomb run down the coast. Off to our left, it was the north, I could see the dim shapes of ships, some of them close to shore. There were warships among them. The country 3,000 feet below us was flat and marshy. Further inland, it was crisscrossed with neat green and brown fields, all divided by low hedges. Farms, roads, hamlets, and enemy tanks were all plain to the naked eye. As the weather was clear, the sun was shining on Brittany, and visibility was good. Then things began to happen fast. First, our 18 250-pound bombs were away. I watched these and the other bombs cascading down from our formation. When they hit the earth, they seemed to draw out plumes of dirty, oily yellow smoke, which grew and joined together until the whole invasion strip of coast was covered in a great pall of smoke. Through this, I could see the flashes of our naval guns. There was no answering fire from coastal batteries. From the amount of high explosive we were pouring on that strip of land down there, it seemed impossible for anything, however small and however deeply hidden, to survive. From time to time, word would come over the intercom phones to keep an eye out on some plane at 2 o'clock or 9 o'clock, which is an air crew's way of giving compass bearings. But though our gunners trained their guns several times, not a single enemy fighter or plane of any kind was sighted. In fact, the only time our guns were fired was when the boys cut loose at those German tanks. It was the same all the way out and all the way back to England. Apart from machine gun fire from the German tanks moving up to counterattack our forces as they landed, our flight was as peaceful as a sky ride between New York and Chicago. This is James Wellard in London. I return you now to the United States.
And from the NBC newsroom in New York, ladies and gentlemen, we continue our report of the coverage of the invasion with Robert St. John.
Here's a bulletin from London which says Allied invasion troops opened the Battle of Europe today with a deep penetration by American and British parachute forces far behind the coast of northern France. It says that landings were made in overwhelming strength along the beaches between the Seine River and Cherbourg. German broadcasts admit that heavy fighting is going on 10 miles inland from the Normandy coast. The German reports describe the invasion as a gigantic operation which they say included powerful air forces and heavy warships. One version is that battleships covered the landing with their fire. From Supreme Headquarters has just come an announcement that the fleet taking part in the invasion does include several battleships, which the Germans say set the whole Seine area ablaze with their fire. And the Germans have just announced that American reinforcements landing at dawn were aided by artificial fire. And the Nazis say that dummy parachutists were dropped in some places just to confuse the defense. Guns of Allied naval forces are operating in a stunning long-range bombing of Germany's defensive positions all along the entire French coastline, says another bulletin. The Germans say Allied bombers ranged as far north as Dunkirk, that unhappy port from which the beaten British Army escaped exactly 4 years ago. All of England resounded with the thunder of their coming and going, says one dispatch. An Associated Press correspondent flying over the French coast in a B-26 Marauder reports seeing fields in France strewn with hundreds of parachutes and also dotted with gliders. And here's a story from a UP correspondent in London who says thousands of Allied planes and the guns of warships, which were drawn from the mightiest fleets in history, laid down an earth-shaking bombardment of the French coast in order to cover landings of shock troops by both parachute and ship. As the invasion got underway, Air Force headquarters announced that the U.S. 9th Air Force is now flying more fighter-bomber missions with more aircraft than any other Air Force in history.
NBC continues its coverage of the invasion news with a report now from the NBC newsroom in Washington.
And this is Richard Harkness in Washington. Only a few minutes ago, the War Department issued an official communique, an official description of our invasion forces operating from a front-line town in the coast of England. Now, this, of course, was an unnamed jump-off point for Allied troops for the invasion of Europe. And the report describes it this way. First, several advance parties of the assault troops marched into the landing stages of this port. They clambered aboard the little blunt-nosed assault craft, and a little later, they climbed on the larger craft swinging at anchor farther out in the harbor. Then, second, gangs of service troops began loading the rations that will sustain the American and English task force while seaborne between England and the European continent. An officer said that there were enough rations put aboard the landing craft to last 8 days, plus 1 day of emergency combat rations. Now, none of the food loaded by the service troops was intended for use on the beaches after the assault troops land. For the first day of land operations, each soldier has been issued 1 day's emergency rations. And after that time, of course, field kitchens will be in operation and hot food served. Now, these final preparations in England were carried out very quietly and without tension by the Army and Navy. They were carried out, too, almost under the noses of the civilian population of this little town in England without attracting the slightest bit of attention. The War Department report said that the assembly areas along the British coastline were changed into marshalling areas beginning on Sunday, and troops were briefed as to their exact missions and reshuffled from battalions into craft loads ready to move at a moment's notice. During this time, the marshalling point was attacked by German aircraft. The result of the enemy action was comparatively minor. And for a week before the jump-off, the troops were billeted in the town, and they were closely restricted to quarters. They were ordered not to talk to civilians and not to talk to any unbriefed soldiers. That is the War Department description of Preparedness Day in a little town on the coast of England. And here is another bulletin from London. Elmer Davis, the director of our Office of War Information, has a warning for the American public. He tells us that the German radio, which broke this historic invasion story, may be trying to build up a reputation for accuracy in their news reports of the invasion so they can put one over on the Allies later. Elmer Davis is asking Americans to remember that Mr. Goebbels is in business for his health and not for yours. Davis makes this statement. The enemy radio is broadcasting reports in their own interests and not in ours. What they have said thus far may be entirely true. I don't know, Davis goes on, because I haven't been following it. But the only information on the development of the invasion that can be relied on will be issued by Allied headquarters. Davis says this: the Germans may be trying to build up the reputation for accuracy during the early period of the invasion so that they can put one over later. When Elmer Davis made this statement, he was sitting at his OWI desk in rolled-up shirt sleeves. He listened to General Eisenhower's message to the European people and commented on the fine voice of the invasion chief. Now, this has been a sleepless night for much of Washington, but until 3:32 a.m. Eastern Wartime this morning, we had no official confirmation of German reports that the invasion of Europe is actually underway. That report came from London. You heard it over the National Broadcasting Company at 3:32 a.m. this morning. And shortly after London flashed the first word of the Nazi claim that we were attacking across the Channel, the information staffs of the Army and the Navy and the Office of War Information began reporting for duty here at our capital. Colonel Albert Warner, the head of the Army Bureau of Public Relations, ordered out his staff on the basis, apparently, of the German reports. Then Commander W.G. Beecher, who is acting director of the Navy's Public Relations, was on the job early with his assistants. And Elmer Davis, director of the Office of War Information, showed up at his office looking as if he had dressed hurriedly. Well, at the White House, the president's mansion was virtually dark. There were only two lights showing, one in the Secret Service room on the first floor, and the other at the White House police gate, which leads to the president's office. Mr. Roosevelt retired early last evening after his radio address to the country last night following the liberation of Rome. But the president obviously knew that tonight was the invasion night and that 3:30 a.m. Eastern Wartime, June 6, 1944, was the time for the official formal announcement. Well, the War Department's famed Pentagon building, which is called the nerve center of the war, looked nothing like that as the reports rolled in after midnight. Outside the building was one cab driver asleep in his car, and inside were a few sleepy guards who had heard no news of this historic report. Now, the press section was the only place in the huge building that showed any activity, and most of that was supplied for the first few hours by newspaper reporters seeking confirmation of the German reports. That is a picture of the news and situation in Washington at this hour this morning, and here is Morgan Beatty, NBC staff commentator of Washington.
Thank you, Dick Harkness. The military reports we've received up to now, most of them, were a part of advanced planning for the invasion. Some of them recordings made in preparation for the attack or just as the assault began, all fitting into plans to advise us accurately, as rapidly as possible, about what was afoot. Some days ago, I sat in Washington with an Army officer who told me in outline what those plans were, including the voice of General Eisenhower, the voice you heard not very long ago. This was a part of operations, the recognition by the armed forces of the necessity of informing the world public as well as fighting the enemy. Naturally, all of this was held back in London until 0 hour had passed. The Germans were given the first opportunity to report the facts, and they did report them, as Dick Harkness told you, perhaps fairly accurately. In any event, however, we won't know until a matter of 72 hours has passed when the German counterattacks will begin. For that reason, we should take with some reserve reports of heavy fighting at this stage. The Germans have long planned to hold back, to wait before they strike back at us in earnest. Now, let's look at this area of northern France where the battle has been joined. We have here the makings of an attack intended to gain, as you've been told before, a major port or ports in France right off the bat. This means that the Allies have chosen the most audacious of all assaults against Fortress Europe at the outset. It's obvious that they are intended to gain the means of landing the greatest number of troops in the shortest period of time against the enemy. It's been estimated by competent authorities that any attack by the Allies or series of attacks in the area of France we're discussing should land at least 6 divisions per day for at least 3 days hand running, all in those 3 days, with heavy air and sea support as well as troops landed on the surface. Here's the reason for this sort of Allied planning. Normandy can absorb only limited numbers of fighting forces on both sides. The Germans, for example, are supposed to be holding in readiness in that area some 20 divisions, or rather back of that area, to counterattack the Allies. Thus, the Allied tactics at the moment would seem to be to land as many troops as possible, as rapidly as possible, to be ready to meet the main German forces held further back. And now that invasion has begun, the preliminary stages will be preparation for the German counterattack. That counterattack presumably cannot be mustered for at least 3 days, as we've noted. It's also noteworthy that the Allies have chosen a strip of France ideally suited for naval support, the strip between Le Havre and the Seine and the Normandy Peninsula. The Germans have a tremendous natural advantage in any invasion effort, the advantage of defensive land forces as against forces borne by sea and air. They also have serious disadvantages. The disadvantages spring from the nature of the German organization across the Channel, the military organization. The enemy keeps only small forces on the coast. Towns and important points are, however, garrisoned as local strong points. That explains why some of the fire, the anti-aircraft fire, reported to you earlier in the evening, was scattered. Le Havre, of course, is such a strong point. And in between these strong points, there are local patrols backed by general support further back. Thus, the whole German problem along the Channel coast is to determine which attack from the Allies is the real thing, so that their support forces can be called up accurately. If they fail in this piece of preliminary detective work, they'll find their main support forces wasting their time on empty coastal areas, while Allied forces elsewhere make headway against very small protective garrisons. It's General Eisenhower's hope that the Germans will fail in their detective work. In the background, of course, the Germans have their own information as to our preparations, information which they are careful to keep away from us. So far, their information seems to be, however, fairly accurate. The Allied job at the moment is to prevent the Germans from knowing where to begin or to bring their support forces, their reinforcements for a coastal area, an area that is, in fact, lightly held except for their coastal guns. It's noteworthy also that the Germans discovered the Dieppe raiders 2 years ago through their naval patrols. They depended on these patrols last night again to signal the first Allied activities that departed from the normal. It's on the report of these patrols that their support forces farther back must be called up. The Germans, we note, gauged the first Allied attack correctly. The German forces, the main forces, defending the part of France behind Le Havre and similar coastal areas, are probably based 20 to 40 miles back of the Atlantic. It's also probable that your German left flank is based on Saint-Nazaire on the Atlantic and their right flank on the Meuse River in Belgium. Between these 2 points, some 300 miles, the main defense line runs along the Sarthe River to the Seine, north of Paris, then into Belgium along the Oise River. The Germans, by their reports to date, clearly indicate that they expect the Allies are trying to flush their defenses in this general line, that we are aiming either at Brittany or Normandy, presumably Normandy exclusively to date, or Le Havre itself, the port for Paris. Thus, the lines of battle up to now have been drawn. Some months ago, Colonel Conrad H. Lanza, retired of the United States Army, surveyed this area of France and surveyed it extremely accurately. Here's what he said. At the west end of Normandy, the Cotentin Peninsula again suggests a desirable invasion area. As in Brittany, at the outer end of the peninsula is an excellent port in every way suitable for major bases. That would be Le Havre. The west side of the peninsula has extensive and good beaches, nearly all at the foot of cliffs. These are not an important hindrance for foot troops, but they are a decided obstacle to vehicles. In places, rocks abound off this coast. As far north Brittany, a sea approach to this area must pass the enemy-held Channel Islands. It must therefore be presumed that an invasion would be known to the enemy for 4 or more hours before it reaches the shore. As a matter of fact, we can now report, although this report was written months ago, we can now report that the Germans did discover the attack apparently 3 hours ahead of time. The east side of the Cotentin Peninsula, that is, the Normandy area, is low and favorable for landing. The north end is precipitous, and it's a part of the east coast and included in extensive fortified areas covering Cherbourg. In spite of numerous bombings, this city has been regularly used by enemy sea traffic, and by the same token, we can apparently use that port as soon as we can get our hands on it. However, the enemy could assemble his troops opposite the Cotentin Peninsula in less time than we could assault that force with heavy forces. Landing areas limited to the south of Cherbourg would have a front of no more than 20 miles. Within this space, the force that can be landed is not large enough to be probably sufficient to overcome enemy resistance. And now, we return you back to Dick Harkness in the newsroom.
Good morning, and this is Richard Harkness in the NBC newsroom in Washington. And now I'm bringing you an interesting sidelight on the invasion operations you've been hearing about during the last few hours this morning. Here in Washington, in many ways an international city, there is a little bit of France, a little bit of Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and nearly every other country involved in this battle of Europe. Now, I am referring, of course, to these countries' embassies and legations. And these are, in effect, branch offices of these foreign governments. And the diplomats who live and work here probably are better informed than anyone else on what's been happening inside their country since the Germans marched in. And sitting across the table from me this morning is Henri Oppenau, the French Committee of National Liberation's minister to the United States. Mr. Oppenau was, until the fall of France, one of the leading officials of the French Foreign Office, and he was one of the sharpest proponents of an anti-Axis policy. He has represented General de Gaulle in Washington since last September, and he knows a great deal about conditions inside France during the Germans' occupation. Mr. Minister, can you tell our NBC listeners this morning what's been happening in your country during the years it's been waiting for liberation?
Mr. Harkness, allow me first of all to say that the moment so eagerly awaited by Frenchmen is now at hand. After 4 years of enemy occupation, of moral and physical suffering, the French people's hopes for salvation is today greater than ever, and is equaled only by their will to fight the Nazis. The Allied have landed. These magic words are passed along from mouth to mouth, whilst impatient and daring Frenchmen are listening closely to the voice telling them from London and Algiers what they should do to help the Allies. On this occasion, I want to thank the American people, who, as a whole, have worked so hard to make this landing possible, and to the relatives of those who are fighting now on French soil, I want to convey the deep sympathy of our people. They are now, as in 1917, the brother-in-arms of French soldiers in the struggle of liberation. I wish them and their commander-in-chief swift success and a victory worthy of their fathers.
Well, Mr. Minister, could you tell us what active support the French underground will be able to give to our armies now that they've landed?
The people of France have suffered under German occupation long enough to hate the enemy. They will do all they can to help the Allies. And when I say that, I'm not making rash promises. We know already that the underground has been helped on many occasions, quite spontaneously, by French men and women who sympathize with the Allies, but who were not actual members of the underground. Let me remind you also of the heroic stand taken by the population of Saint-Nazaire during the famous English commando raid on March 28, 1942. Then the whole civilian population of that Breton port arose to help the British commando and fought for 3 days against the German garrison. They paid dearly for it, not only during the battle, but also during German reprisals. More than 600 French men and women perished during those 3 days. The spirit of Saint-Nazaire is typical of the spirit of the French nation. More recently, the town of Grenoble in the Alps was awarded the Cross of Liberation for its action against the German barracks and German depots, which were blown up after the Germans refused to free some 50 hostages taken from the population of Grenoble in reprisal for other previous acts of sabotage. The French underground know that it can't count on the help of ordinary Frenchmen and women when the time comes for them to do their part by the side of the Allies.
But, Mr. Minister, hasn't the underground been pretty well crushed by German arrests and deportations?
I cannot, of course, divulge the secret of the organization of the underground, but I can tell you that 4 years of underground fighting has prepared the underground for today's task, that it's still organized in spite of German measures taken at the time of the Allies' landing. Whenever one leader falls, 2 or 3 are ready to replace them.
Well, we have heard here in Washington, Mr. Minister, that the underground was lacking in arms. Is this still true?
Every fighter in the underground is not yet fully equipped, but the underground has shown great resourcefulness in obtaining its equipment. It has, first of all, helped itself from the arms depot left over when the French Armistice Army was demobilized in 1942. And then it has also used some of the Italian army material that was abundant at the time of the confusion created by the Italian armistice. Also, it has often attacked German depots for the purpose of gathering guns, grenades, and ammunition. And finally, the Allies have found means of conveying to the underground the indispensable equipment for the participation of organized groups in a modern war.
Well, thank you, Mr. Henri Oppenau, Minister to Washington from the French Committee of National Liberation.
Thank you, Dick Harkness, Monsieur Oppenau, and Morgan Beatty. Now NBC continues its coverage of the invasion. We return you to the NBC newsroom in New York.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its coverage by taking you to David Anderson in London.
After H hour, there was practically no sign of German army transport on any of the roads in the whole of the invasion area. At 1:30 yesterday afternoon, I entered the gates of an RAF station. Little did I realize at the time that within hours, the big show would be on. And yet, no sooner had I checked in with the adjutant than I was told that I couldn't leave the station under any circumstances until after H hour. Though I was prepared to stay for several days, I didn't fancy the idea of spending an indefinite period of time in a cold, windy tent. That's all the housing accommodation offered on a tactical field, since the flyers and crew must be prepared to move camp on short notice. But my fears of a long isolation were short-lived. The adjutant introduced me to the group captain, the youngest, incidentally, in the entire RAF. He's only 27, and yet it seemed that he looked considerably older yesterday. The climax in tactical bombing was to be reached last night. I sensed this immediately as he smiled briefly and said out of the corner of his mouth, "I've been waiting for this for a long time." He was full of apologies when he told me that he couldn't take me on an operational flight. If I were to go, it would mean that one of the pilots would have to fly without a navigator. On these vital D-Day operations, that would be suicidal, he said. But he did consent to take me up for a short hop. He called it a flip, in order that I might get a better picture of the job facing the pilots, and so that I might see some of the ships waiting to hit the beaches. We took off and struck out for one of the invasion ports. It was at a place where Jerry had done poor reconnaissance work. For miles, I saw ships dotting the water below. These were some of the ships which even now are touching the north coast of France. Even though I was impressed with the size of this convoy, the group captain told me that this was a comparatively small-sized convoy. We circled back to the field, and I could see that the groupie's thoughts were engrossed in the operation due to begin in a very few hours. I knew, too, that he was disappointed, since he had mentioned that he was grounded on D-Day. He could be of too much use to the enemy had he been captured. After we had landed, the group captain went out to attend to last-minute details, but not before he had offered me all of the facilities at his disposal. This offer included a glimpse into the Holy of Holies, his map room. For days, guards had been posted there, both outside and inside this room. Some were armed with Bren guns. Others carried rifles with fixed bayonets. The enemy at all costs must be kept away from this vital information. Information which, it has been proven, he did not possess. I was able to roam around the field at will and to participate in the briefings for this D-Day operation. There were two of these. The one was conducted by the group captain and the other by the respective wing commanders. The first was quite general, a final brushing up on bombing and strapping tactics. I was particularly impressed by the emphasis laid on the safety factor, the proper height from which to bomb, the obstacles to be encountered, and a reminder to the pilots to judge their height above ground correctly in order to avoid running into the side of a hill. The second briefing concerned the flight itself, the D-Day operation. Although no one was told that H hour would come when he was over the north coast of France, a matter of security in case of one of them fell into the hands of the enemy, there was no one in the briefing room who doubted that his was a D-Day job. This could be seen by the tenseness with which each man listened. Everyone was anxious to get on with the job, to try the next step in the tactical air warfare, which is designed to keep the Germans from moving into the operational area. I stood with the group captain and watched the planes take off. Hardly had the first plane taxied to the head of the runway when he turned to me and said, "That's where I should have been. But they can't keep me out of the air tomorrow," he continued. One by one, the planes circled overhead to get their final bearings before making the flight to this all-important coast of France. Each man had his area of attack. Each man knew what was expected of him. But as I watched the planes take off, I noticed something strange, something brand new for the Germans to see. No longer were the planes camouflaged. Last night, for the first time, these planes bore the markings of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force. These markings consist of alternate black and white stripes on the wings and belly. These markings, I understand, were put on all Allied planes by order of General Eisenhower in order that Allied ships would have an easier task in distinguishing them between friend and foe. This is essential in an operation of this magnitude. As a matter of fact, the paint hardly had time to dry, since this was all last-minute work. From the airfield, we went into the control room. There was nothing to do now but wait. I noticed the estimated time of return and strolled through the control tower. I was waiting in the briefing room once again as the first pilots reported. Their task had been to hunt out and shoot up or bomb any German transport on the roads on the French coast. From the very beginning, it was hoped that none would be seen. This would be a definite indication that the Hun didn't know where we were going to land. And as the boys came back, one by one, this hope was realized. Except for a few scattered cars on the road, nothing was seen. Most of the pilots saw no transport whatsoever, so they concentrated on bombing road junctions and railways. The Germans were caught napping. The work of this RAF tactical group was only one part of a gigantic program. Before these boys had finished their missions, the airborne troops, British and American, were dropped in their appointed places. Then RAF bombers went out to work on the landing beaches. They dropped between 6,000 to 8,000 tons of bombs. Capacity loads were carried last night. Shortly before dawn, the Allied naval guns began shelling the beach area. And at the same time, American liberators and fortresses took over where the RAF left off. Before the sun had risen over the horizon, Allied troops were landed behind a smoke screen. They were guided to the landing beaches by markers, set out by midget submarines, which spent 3 days in crossing the channel to carry out this most important but hazardous task. Now, the Allies are on the beaches in force. Ahead of them are the airborne troops. Between them and in front of the airborne troops are the Germans. The job has just begun. And yet, as I left the RAF station a couple of hours ago, I came away with a feeling that the reports brought back by the flyers were just those that we had hoped for. The Hun was surprised. Now it's up to us to take advantage of this. I now return you to the United States.
The National Broadcasting Company continues its worldwide news coverage of this epic-making event, the invasion of France by the Allies, with a broadcast and report by H.B. Kaltenborn.
Good morning, everybody. Let me summarize for you some of the various broadcasts that many of you may have been listening to for the last 3 hours. Our first news of the invasion came from the Germans at approximately 1 o'clock this morning. And here is what they told us in detail. It's interesting because obviously we know now that at least the invasion part of it is true, and it is quite possible that they are giving us additional information to that which the Allied command has thus far released. The Germans say early this Tuesday morning numerous landing craft and light warships were observed in the area between the mouth of the Seine and the eastern coast of Normandy. That is confirmed by everything that we have heard since as to the place of the landing. That is a very favorable strip of French coast. There is more flat land in that area than almost anywhere else. It is an ideal place for parachute landings, glider landings. It is strategically located with reference to the French railroads. It is, although some 80 miles from the British coast, also favorably located with regard to the British ports, and is, from our point of view, an ideal place for landing. At one end is Le Havre, the most important French port in northern France, which, if we can secure it, will ease our problem of landing tremendously, for obviously these first landings are only a tiny fraction of what is going to follow. And also it runs on up to Cherbourg, another important port, also connected with Paris, with France, with Belgium, by important railroad lines. Obviously, those railroad lines have been in good part destroyed, but once we isolate certain sections of the French coast, conquer them, we can very readily restore them. This, then, is the place of the first invasion. But remember that the first invasion will undoubtedly be followed by several others. Just a few minutes ago came a bulletin that the Berlin radio, monitored by NBC today, broadcast that strong enemy air attacks have been launched on the Dieppe area. Well, now Dieppe is much farther to the north and to the west, and Dieppe is also a tremendously important French port closer to the Belgian frontier, controlling a different network of railroads. And it is quite possible that invasion number 2 will be in the Dieppe area. And so we must expect that hour by hour we will hear of landings at other points. The Germans go on and tell us at the same time paratroops were dropped from numerous aircraft on the northern tip of the Normandy Peninsula. And we have had this morning picturesque, dramatic accounts of how our planes, our transports carrying these paratroops, flew over the channel under the light of a bright moon, the channel smooth, and found very little activity on the invasion coast. And according to all the reports that have reached us, the invasion safely and successfully begun. It is believed, the Germans say, that these paratroops have been given the task of capturing airfields in order to facilitate the landing of further paratroops. That is undoubtedly true, and I venture the prediction that since we have probably landed these paratroops at specific airfields, that at least one or more are already in our possession. German naval forces, we are told, have engaged enemy landing craft off the coast. There is no report that has come to us from Allied sources that indicates that German naval forces in any strength are present. Fighting is proceeding, we know, 10 miles inland, and other indications from those who accompanied our paratroops indicate that possibly we have penetrated as far as 16 miles in our first invasion effort. General Eisenhower's order of the day was transmitted to you, in which he began by telling his men, you are about to embark on the great crusade. We had a broadcast from one of the landing craft en route to France, and the picture that we got from that landing craft was of a tremendous armada making its way across the channel to the French coast. Yes, even the initial invasion is on an enormous scale, a far larger amphibious operation than any so far in all recorded history. General Eisenhower also broadcast to the enslaved countries of Europe, and I was impressed with his emphasis on France. He said that he was proud to have the gallant forces of France under his command, that obedience to all orders was essential from now on, that order in France would be preserved by Frenchmen wherever Allied troops land and take control, and gave them the promise again that they will be permitted to choose their own government as soon as that is possible. He asked them to cooperate in every way possible, told them that everything would be done that could be done to mitigate the hardships of invasion, and pointed out that French resistance thus far to the German invader has been an inspiring example. A new phase of the air offensive has started, a BBC broadcast declared. It will affect the entire coastal zone situated not less than 35 kilometers inland from the French coast. That's 20-odd miles, indicating that our landings will penetrate much farther inland than they have thus far in the first stage. We've had messages from various Allied leaders. The King of Norway spoke in Norwegian to his people, and he suggested to me very definitely in what he said the possibility of early landings in Norway. For he did not, as did the Prime Minister of Netherlands and the Prime Minister of Belgium, emphasize so much that the time for their resistance had not yet come. And now, I'll let you listen to the first official invasion announcement as broadcast from General Eisenhower's headquarters.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The text of Communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. The communique will be repeated. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. This ends the reading of Communique number 1 from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force.
There was a very interesting broadcast that came to us from the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He asked his fellow countrymen to pass on his words, but to do so only to trustworthy compatriots. He told them that the Dutch forces would have to fulfill their allotted task, and then gave them their orders. And he emphasized, as did several of the other commanders and chieftains of the countries Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the fact that the orders given do not apply to the organized resistance forces. This indicates very definitely that we have already organized resistance forces in all the occupied countries, and that these general broadcasts that went out this morning are intended for the people as a whole, and that we have other means, secret means, for reaching the leaders of the organized resistance forces. And so these broadcasts from the King of Norway, from the Prime Minister of Belgium and the Prime Minister of the Netherlands were intended to give special instructions to the people as a whole, not to those who are going to lead the active resistance when the time comes. And here is what the Prime Minister of Netherlands asked of his people. 1, that they engage in no acts of violent open resistance. 2, that any such act would invite reprisals on others and therefore must be avoided. 3, that there should be all possible passive resistance. 4, that they should refrain from any act that would be of advantage to the enemy. 5, that they should watch closely their own behavior and that they should listen to instructions as frequently and constantly as possible. And 6, that when more forceful action is needed from the people as a whole, they would be advised. The purpose of this is to prevent the Germans from provoking resistance before the time has come, and in that way perhaps to discover the leaders of the resistance movement. We had an excellent broadcast from Wright Bryan, managing editor of the Atlantic Journal and reporter for WSB, NBC's Atlanta affiliate. He gave us the story of the landing of the first spearhead paratroops. He watched 17 out of 18 men leave a plane, pointed out to us that very few tracers were met, that there was practically no resistance to the first phase of the air invasion, that there was no sign of Allied escorting fighter planes, but also no German fighter planes. And that is important because that means that the aerial opposition to the invasion was slight indeed. Taking everything into account, it is evident to us here in the NBC newsroom that the first phase of the invasion has been carried through successfully. It is in large force. We have landed at several important points. We are going forward with every indication of continued success.
H.V. Kaltenborn has just brought you a summary of this night's historic events. Again, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned to your NBC station for NBC's worldwide coverage of the news as it happens. And now, the Stars and Stripes Forever. You've just heard the Stars and Stripes Forever. And now, a brief pause for station identification.
WEAF, New York.
Ladies and gentlemen, NBC's worldwide coverage of the news tonight has included reports and commentary from H.V. Kaltenborn, David Anderson in London, Wright Bryan, on-the-spot report overseas, Robert St. John from New York, John W. Vandercook from overseas, and Morgan Beatty and Richard Harkness from Washington. And now we continue NBC's worldwide coverage with a report from Robert St. John in New York.
Here's a bulletin from an advanced fighter base in England. It says, the beaches of northern France are alive right now with Allied troops. Allied troops landing in wave after wave. That's the story brought back by fighter pilots returning from the French invasion coast. The landings were carried out under the red glare and the black smoke of Allied and German guns exchanging fire across the Channel waters. Here's a bulletin from London. The military correspondent of the British Reuters agency reports that Adolf Hitler himself is taking personal command of all German anti-invasion operations. Hitler is said to be surrounded by his staff, which includes 4 Nazi field marshals, and he's believed to have moved his headquarters to some place in northern France. The German radio has just warned Holland to expect invasion. Berlin says to Holland, the hour has struck. The Nazis told the Dutch, we don't know where the next blow may fall, so prepare yourselves for all eventualities. Berlin radio, monitored by NBC, has broadcast that strong Allied air attacks have been launched on the Dieppe area. DNB, that's a German news agency, claims that big Allied warships have been set on fire by German guns in the Seine estuary. There is no confirmation from our side of that report. And now here's a bulletin from London that says the first Allied paratroopers to land in German-occupied France today met only scattered small arms fire from the fields. One of the latest German broadcasts describes a constant flow of Allied reinforcements to the beachheads. Berlin is constantly emphasizing the power and ferocity of the Allied air attack and the Allied ground attack. The Germans admit that some of their key airfields have already been wiped out, although the invasion is only a few hours old. Other air bases, they say, have been badly mauled. Reports to Allied headquarters say that American Mitchell and British Mosquito bombers are smashing bridges and railroads, that they're wrecking highways, that they're cutting junction points in order to hinder the German concentration of troops at danger spots. Dutch, Polish, and Australian, as well as American, Canadian, and British squadrons are taking part in the Great Allied aerial attack. The pilots report little movement on the roads and very few Nazi planes in the sky. The Germans have admitted already that the Allies are succeeding to some extent. A DNB broadcast said the German defense forces, which were deceived by the dropping of paratroop dummies, are engaged in fighting with enemy airborne troops and have made numerous British and American prisoners. Well, of course, the Germans would say that. There's no confirmation of it. Here's another bulletin which says the bulk of the naval forces in the invasion operation were provided by the British and American navies, with about 3 British ships to 2 American ships. All other Allied nations provided their quota of the invasion vessels. American Thunderbolt pilots returning from the invasion front today reported they met no enemy aircraft, although they did encounter considerable flak as they provided protective cover for the amphibious troops. All the Thunderbolts returned safely to England. Right now, a shattering barrage, such as reduced the defenders of the Mediterranean island of Pantelleria last summer, such a barrage as that, only much, much greater, is being laid down by the combined air forces. Added to this tremendous barrage is the thunder from warships. The American Coast Guard is over there manning landing craft and transports and rescue ships. In the landing craft are men who know the beaches on which they're to land like they know the backs of their hands. For months, in English camps, they drilled down to the finest detail for their job. They'd formed into combat teams, some of those teams 12 men, some of them several thousand. One source at Allied headquarters said he believed that little help can be expected at the start from the inhabitants of invaded areas because all able-bodied persons have been evacuated by the enemy. Only women, children, the aged, and the infirm were left behind. They were left behind deliberately by the Germans as potential hindrances to Allied operations. As the day progressed, DNB broadcast frequent claims of progress. 4 Allied parachute and airborne divisions are taking part in the invasion, so the Nazis say. And 1 force of paratroopers, which landed in the Seine estuary, according to Berlin, has been wiped out. But we can't believe that yet.
And now, for further reports on the Allied invasion of Europe, we take you to the nation's capital, to Richard Harkness in the NBC newsroom in Washington.
Good morning. Well, when we think of this attack on Hitler's fortress Europe today, we think of it as being purely military. But the fact is that behind this invasion news is a long period of diplomatic maneuvering, a long period of diplomatic pulling and tugging. Well, these diplomatic operations date back almost to the day of Pearl Harbor. And since that time, the Russians in general, Stalin in particular, have been applying every kind of pressure to persuade the Americans and the British to open a real second front on the continent of Europe. And President Roosevelt and General George C. Marshall, our chief of staff, were generally sympathetic to Marshal Stalin's demand. But Prime Minister Churchill, hard-headed, cautious, held off. And now that the invasion has come, the Russians might very well be firing off one of those big artillery salutes of theirs in Moscow. And only history can tell whether Mr. Churchill was a hard-headed military realist or whether by holding off, whether the Prime Minister was overly cautious. Instead of throwing our strength across the British Channel in early 1942, as Stalin wanted, Churchill mapped instead our invasion of North Africa. Stalin called for his second front in Western Europe again in 1943. And instead, we invaded Italy that spring. Well, during this period, Premier Stalin refused even to meet with the President and Mr. Churchill. Stalin's one price for a meeting was a statement, a guarantee, really, of when America and Great Britain would open this real second front. Well, Stalin received this guarantee, even the approximate date, at Tehran. And now our invasion of Europe is climaxing one of the most amazing diplomatic chapters of world history. Well, this bit of pre-invasion history goes back to May 1942, right here in Washington, our capital. The President received V.M. Molotov, the personal spokesman for Marshal Stalin. This meeting was kept secret, but after Molotov returned to Moscow, the White House issued a formal statement on the conversation. And here in a nutshell is the important part of that statement. In the course of these conversations, full understanding was reached with regard to the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. That statement, of course, was couched in broad language, but all newsmen in Washington knew that Molotov went back to Moscow firmly convinced that Russia's allies would invade Western Europe, and firmly convinced, too, that the invasion would come before January 1st, 1943. That recall was in May of 1942. A month later, in June, Mr. Churchill followed Molotov to Washington to see President Roosevelt. While Molotov had argued eloquently and persuasively for a second front in 1942, the British Prime Minister was equally forceful on the other side of the question. Mr. Churchill lowered his head like a bull, to put it figuratively, and bluntly asserted that there would be no second front in Western Europe in 1942. The Prime Minister said that any invasion at that time would be for what he called strictly political reasons, for the purpose of placating Russia, and the Prime Minister said that the British weren't having any thank you. Well, as history looks back on Mr. Churchill's visit here, it must accord him a great deal of logic. Tobruk fell, even while the Prime Minister talked at the White House, and Marshal Rommel led his Axis army across the border clear into Egypt. So Stalin had to be told that there would be no invasion of Western Europe in 1942. Well, it still is not a matter of public record. We'll have to wait until the war is over. But Stalin's reply must have been as fiery as Russian vodka. For almost immediately after, in July, that was less than a month after Mr. Churchill went back home, Mr. Roosevelt sent a distinguished mission to London. In a special plane were General Marshall, our top-ranking military officer, Admiral Ernest J. King, our top-ranking naval officer, Mr. Harry L. Hopkins, the President's closest friend and advisor, and, making up the party, Mr. Stephen T. Early, the President's press secretary. Well, as the story was told later, General Marshall and Admiral King tried to talk Mr. Churchill into changing his mind about a second front, but Churchill still said no. As an alternative, the American delegation proposed our invasion of Africa. The British accepted the proposition, and Mr. Roosevelt set out to explain the situation to the Russians. The President promised this, that action would be taken to divert German strength from the attack on Russia. Then, to carry on this diplomatic sugaring of Premier Stalin, Winston Churchill went to Moscow in person to try to make the Russian leaders see why the invasion was delayed. But Stalin obviously was not appeased. His reply was blunt. The United States and Great Britain, he said, should make good on that promise given Molotov in Washington. We should invade fully, and, he said, we should invade on time. But instead, we went ahead and invaded North Africa, what the Prime Minister called then the soft underbelly of the Axis, on the night of November 7th, a Saturday of 1942. Well, by this time, Stalin was finally convinced that there would be no invasion of Western Europe in 1942. So, grudgingly, he did acknowledge the Anglo-American drive against the Axis, against Marshal Rommel, and his Africa Corps. And grudgingly, it seemed, Stalin told the world that our African operation fulfilled the perquisites for undertaking a second front. But when the President met with Churchill at Casablanca, Stalin stayed in Russia. Now, he was cordially invited, but he messaged our two war leaders that he was too busy fighting the Nazis. And then, shortly after Casablanca, Stalin threw a new diplomatic bombshell into the Anglo-American camp. In a special order of the day, a special order celebrating the anniversary of the Red Army, Stalin said this on February 23rd, 1943. I quote the head of the Russian government. In view of the absence of a second front in Europe, the Red Army alone is bearing the whole weight of the war. Well, Mr. Roosevelt and the Prime Minister held another meeting in May of last year, back in Washington this time. Our two leaders decided that they must see Stalin. So, a little later, the President sent Joseph E. Davies, the former ambassador to Moscow, on another mission to Moscow. Well, Davies' trip, as we learned later, was for only one purpose. And the purpose was this, to invite Stalin to meet with our Anglo-American commanders-in-chief and to get a definite answer to bring back to the White House. Well, Stalin replied, apparently, that he was agreeable to a meeting at this time, a session which he said should be held a little later in the summer, last summer. Well, the march of events made it necessary for Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill to meet again in August of 1943. They waited until the last minute before setting this meeting, hoping to hear from Stalin exactly where and when he would make the conference a Big Three meeting instead of a Big Two. But when no word came from Moscow, the President and the Prime Minister held their own session at Quebec. Well, I covered this session at Quebec for the National Broadcasting Company. And standing there as the President and Mr. Churchill held their final press and radio conference, I saw how they emphasized their wish that Stalin might have made the party a threesome, and how fervently they hoped that Stalin would join them later on. But Stalin did not join them, and as we know now, his price was still when will you invade Western Europe, and obviously our President and the Prime Minister of Great Britain were not yet ready to tell him, at least not in advance of Quebec. Well, then finally, we proposed this plan. Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, flew to Moscow and set the stage for a meeting of foreign ministers. That is, Secretary of State Cordell Hull for the United States, Mr. Eden for Great Britain, and Foreign Commissar Molotov, the same man who had come to Washington to get a second front, for the Russians. Well, now, this session was to be held in Moscow, and it took place, all right, in October of 1943. And then, after the Declaration of Moscow, which was hailed throughout the United Nations world as a great success, Stalin did agree to meet President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. Well, our two leaders held a preliminary talk in Cairo. They conferred there with the Chinese Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. And then, flying in separate planes to confuse the Germans, they went on to Tehran, where at last they met Stalin. Well, there, as we know now, the President and Mr. Churchill promised Stalin a second front in Western Europe. And they named the date, the spring of 1944. The date now burns so indelibly in Anglo-American military history. And not only that, in explaining why we had waited so long, Mr. Roosevelt and Mr. Churchill promised that when the invasion date arrived, it would be the mightiest amphibious assault the world has ever seen. And obviously, from the news reports which have been coming into the NBC newsroom here in Washington all night, this is the mightiest amphibious assault the world has ever seen. And Stalin agreed to this plan. But with the manner of a man wanting to make absolutely certain, Stalin wanted to know the name of the man who would lead the invasion. Well, a man's name was sent to Mr. Stalin 3 days later. The leader of these combined Anglo-American forces was to be General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Stalin accepted. And showing how well satisfied he was with the selection of Eisenhower, he conferred upon General Ike one of the highest awards of the Russian government. The only award, incidentally, which Stalin himself has accepted in this World War II. So that is the diplomatic history behind the invasion of Europe. But with the closing of that book, the Allies and Russia began a new diplomatic game. The diplomatic game looking toward the peace that will follow our invasion success. Now, our invasion of Western Europe, just revealed this evening, has settled a big diplomatic issue between the three top-ranking United Nations. But still, as peace draws nearer, there is no clear light ahead on three other knotty diplomatic problems. There is still no agreement, at least no public agreement, on how we will handle post-war Germany. Now, Stalin has his Free German Committee, which could mean that Stalin intends to dominate Germany by pulling the strings while the puppet German leaders dance. However, we have heard very little of the Stalin's Free German Committee recently, and so there probably will be Russian cooperation with Great Britain and the United States on post-war Germany. Another problem, Stalin recognized the government of the one-time fascist Badoglio in Italy. And so far, we in the British have withheld that full recognition. However, that point has become largely academic, what with the liberation of Rome and the stepping aside of King Victor Emmanuel. Well, Great Britain went into this war to make good on her pledges to Poland. But still, Russia is calling the tune in Poland. And now that the invasion is on, those diplomatic problems come even more to the front. So there is the diplomatic background to this mighty invasion effort which was formally announced at 3:32 this morning, Eastern War Time. Stalin has been applying every bit of diplomatic pressure he could to force this second front. He has been applying this pressure ever since May 1942, when President Roosevelt virtually promised a second front in Western Europe. We, that is, Mr. Roosevelt, the Chief of Staff General Marshall, were willing to try this cross-channel invasion long before this. But Prime Minister Churchill held off. And instead of Europe, we invaded North Africa in the fall of 1942. We drove across the Mediterranean to Italy in 1943. But at Tehran, Stalin drew a definite promise from the President and Mr. Churchill, a promise being carried out this morning on the beaches of once-conquered France.